At the dawn of the 12th century, Europe was waking from a long, slow convulsion. The papacy had found new confidence, knights returned restless from the Levant, and pilgrim trails hummed with the footsteps of those who had seen Jerusalem and could not leave its image behind. In the wake of the First Crusade, the map of Christendom had been redrawn in sudden, fragile ways. It was in that space between fervor and necessity that the idea of a new kind of brotherhood took root, one that mixed prayer with the sword. Most watched from afar. A few stepped forward to mix devotion with danger. Subscribe if you'd have had the courage to be one of them. The shock of 1099 remained vivid, holy places retaken, banners planted upon the city that Christendom had yearned for, and a stream of pilgrims who flocked to the sacred sites with awe and fear. Roads that led to Jerusalem were not safe. Bandits, hostile forces, and the instability of newly formed states meant that pilgrims could be attacked, robbed, or killed. Protecting those souls became not a mere courtesy but an urgent Christian task, and the notion of organized protection drew imaginations across Europe and the Latin East. Out of this need rose a modest, almost tentative beginning. Around 1119 or 1120, a small group of knights, led by a man named Hugues de Payens and joined by companions such as Godfrey of St. Omer, took vows before the king of Jerusalem and set themselves near the Temple Mount. Their earliest charge was narrow and practical, to escort pilgrims safely between coastal ports and the holy places. Yet their presence on that ancient rock, where Solomon's temple once stood, would color their identity and their destiny. They called themselves initially the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name that announced both humility and a claim upon the sacred past. The ruins of the Temple Mount resonated in medieval imaginations, a suggestion of divine favor and of an order rooted in biblical memory. The name was not a casual affectation. It bound the new brotherhood to a storied tradition and gave them an architectural and spiritual anchor in a city of layered sanctity. Those first years were precarious. The knights lacked lands, a formal rule, and the broad recognition that alone could secure recruits and donations. They lived simply, wearing a coarse cloak and sleeping under sparse shelter, while they rode the roads and manned the passes. Pilgrims would have seen them as odd figures, simultaneously pious and armed, modest in appearance yet bound by a devotion that called for readiness to spill blood if necessary. Word of the small brotherhood traveled back to Europe through the veins of clerics and returning pilgrims, and it found resonance at a moment when monastic reform and chivalric energy were both at a peak. The Cistercian movement had revived a strict, contemplative monasticism, while the ideals of knighthood were being refined into codes of honor and service. The Templars would fuse these currents into something new, a militant monasticism that asked men to combine the disciplines of cloister with the tactics of war. Crucial to the Templars' transformation from a handful of guardians into an international institution was the intervention of powerful patrons. Hugues de Payens and his companions journeyed to Europe to plead for formal backing. They appealed to nobles and bishops, to those whose piety and resources could anchor their cause. It was in this process of petition and patronage that the order began to acquire the network that would make it unusual in medieval Christendom. Bernard of Clairvaux, the towering Cistercian abbot and theologian, became an early and decisive advocate. With clarity and rhetorical force, he argued that the Templars fit within the logic of spiritual life. Their military service was a form of Christian devotion, an extension of the monastic vow of obedience. Bernard's sermons reframed the image of a soldier in white mantle. He turned the sword into an instrument of sanctified labor and gave the order an aura of sacramental justification. His support carried weight. In 1129, a council at Troyes adopted a formal rule for the order, drawing on Cistercian discipline and adapting it for armed life. That rule defined daily schedules of prayer, requirements of chastity and poverty, and a strict hierarchy to govern behavior. It also established the tension at the heart of the Brotherhood. A life of contemplation and communal prayer was to be preserved even as men learned to fight and to command in the rough politics of Outremer. Recognition by the papacy would follow. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued Omnidatum Optimum, a papal bull that gave the Templars remarkable privileges: exemption from local ecclesiastical jurisdiction, permission to build, to receive donations, and to move freely across Christendom. The order was transformed from a pious experiment into an entity with international legal personality, answerable directly to the Pope and freed from interference by bishops. That autonomy would be both a source of strength and a seed of future mistrust. From the ramparts of Acre to the quiet countryside of Champagne, the Templars began to build a network. Estates and preceptories across Europe provided income, recruits, and logistical support. The order's houses were not merely farms but training grounds and administrative centers where novice knights learned horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the liturgical rhythms appropriate to their vocation. In the east, fortified castles controlled mountain passes and sea approaches, standing as strongpoints in a fragile chain of Latin authority. Money followed reputation. Donors, noble families and monarchs, abbots and urban elites, gave land, money, and legal privileges. In return, they received spiritual benefits, protection for pilgrims, and, often, the prestige of association with an elite brotherhood. The Templars gathered diverse incomes, rents from estates, revenues from tolls and ports, and gifts bestowed in wills. Over time, their stewardship of wealth became sophisticated, extending into transactions that would look startlingly modern. One of the most consequential developments was the gradual accumulation of financial and logistical expertise. Confronted with the practical problem of moving wealth safely across dangerous territories, the Templars developed systems akin to letters of credit and safe deposit. A merchant or noble could deposit coin in a European preceptory and withdraw funds in the East, backed by the order's network. These operations rested on trust, written receipts, and the order's legal status, which made houses under Templar care sanctuaries recognized by papal privilege. The order's military role expanded as well. No longer content with mere escort duty, the Templars became seasoned fighters, engineers, and siege experts. They learned to build concentric fortifications, to use trebuchets and countermines, and to organize rapid cavalry strikes in the plains of the Near East. Their white mantle and single red cross became a visible emblem of their commitment, a banner under which European knights rallied and which struck fear into adversaries who knew the Templars' reputation for discipline. In battle, the Templars cultivated a formidable esprit de corps. Knights were heavy cavalrymen, trained to charge and to hold ground, supported by sergeants and squires who could perform skirmishing duties. They emphasized unit discipline, often choosing to stand and fight rather than scatter in confusion. Every engagement taught lessons that were hard-won: the value of supply lines, the perils of overextension, the need for local alliances, and accurate intelligence about enemy movements. The period between the mid-12th and late 13th centuries was one of fluctuating fortunes for Outremer, and the Templars experienced both triumph and catastrophe. They were present at great sieges and in the politics of Crusader states, sometimes acting as kingmakers, sometimes as bulwarks against collapse. Their castles, Carrick, Croix de Chevaliers, Jacob's Ford, were not merely military sites but centers of administration and often places where the daily rhythms of monastic life continued under bell and chapel. Relations with the Hospitallers, another great military order, were complex, mixing collaboration and rivalry. Both served the overarching aim of holding Christian territories and protecting pilgrims, but their origins and emphases differed. The Hospitallers had roots in hospital care and later fortified themselves, while the Templars were monastically founded warriors. Competition for donations, influence, and strategic command sometimes brought them into tense negotiations, and the politics of the Latin East demanded frequent coordination and occasional disputes. In Europe, the Templars' presence altered social landscapes. Preceptories became centers of economic activity, landlords who negotiated with local tenants, administered justice on their domains, and engaged in agricultural innovation. They bred horses and maintained breeding programs that supplied the demands of heavy cavalry. In towns, their properties could be hubs for commerce. Near ports, they sometimes controlled land that drained revenues from maritime trade, further linking the order to mercantile circuits. Alongside martial prowess and financial acumen, the order cultivated mystique. The image of monks who knew the rites of prayer and yet rode to battle with the same devotion gave them an aura that medieval storytellers and chroniclers could amplify. Pilgrims told tales of valiant white-clad protectors, while enemies whispered of a secretive brotherhood that accumulated wealth and influence. Such stories would grow in the telling, feeding reputations that were part fact, part embellishment. Cultural exchange shaped the Templars' practices in surprising ways. In the Levant, they encountered Muslim military architecture, administrative techniques, and even veterinary practices that influenced their own strategies. Interaction with Byzantine and Islamic administrators taught them the practicalities of diplomacy and message networks. The order's adaptability in adopting useful tactics and technologies helped sustain its military edge and its administrative competence. The Templars' internal life was governed by the rule they accepted at Troyes and the interpretive guidance that followed. The order maintained daily offices, communal meals, and strict standards of behavior, but it also allowed for a diversity of roles. Some were ordained priests who conducted mass and cared for souls, others were brothers who specialized in letters, stewardship, or construction. Yet all were bound by vows to obedience, chastity, and a form of poverty that was shaped by communal holding rather than personal destitution. Recruitment into the order drew men from different classes. Younger sons of nobility often sought the Templars as a path to a meaningful life and a chance at martial glory, while lesser-born men could enter as sergeants and rise through service. Families could endow a son to the order, hoping for spiritual benefit and social security. The order's cosmopolitan nature, men from France, England, Spain, Italy, and beyond, created a networked identity that transcended any single national loyalty. Educational and liturgical life mattered deeply. Novices were instructed in psalmody, Latin prayer, and the practical disciplines of seamanship and horsemanship. Chapels within preceptories hosted daily offices, and the rhythm of the monastic day shaped attitudes toward duty and sacrifice. Even as knights trained in warcraft, they were expected to maintain the interior life requested by their vows, a balance that was at times difficult and at times inspirational. As wealth accumulated, so did criticism. The Templars' exemption from local authorities and their direct papal accountability allowed them to act across borders, sometimes causing friction with bishops and monarchs who resented what seemed like a parallel power structure. Rumors about secretive initiations, the order's riches, and its autonomy began to gather in corners where envy and fear met. For some observers, the Templars embodied the best of chivalric service. For others, they represented a challenging concentration of ecclesiastical and martial authority. The political landscape of late medieval Europe intensified such tensions. Kings with expansive fiscal needs found the Templars' coffers and international network tempting. In particular, a powerful monarch could view the order as both a rival and a resource. Yet using force against an order protected by papal privilege required a precarious mix of political calculation and moral pretext. It is in this crucible of power, debt, and accusation that the seeds of the final crisis were planted. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 to Saladin and the subsequent defeats in Outremer were a heavy blow to Latin Christendom and to the Templars. The Battle of Hattin was a catastrophe. Many Templar knights were captured, and their ability to hold key territories was compromised. The fall of Jerusalem pushed the order into defensive retrenchment and renewed emphasis on fortress construction and maritime security. It also injected deeper urgency into fundraising and recruitment drives across Europe. The Third Crusade brought new visibility to the Templars, who remained committed to the cause and participated in campaigns that sought to regain lost ground. Figures such as Richard the Lionheart and Philip II engaged the Templars as allies and as reliable military professionals. Yet the fractious suits of crusading politics, competing claims, shifting alliances, and strategic disagreements meant that the Templars often navigated treacherous diplomatic waters that required both firmness and subtlety. Back in Europe during the 13th century, the order's administrative structures matured into a sophisticated bureaucracy. Preceptories reported to regional masters who coordinated recruitment, supplies, and the flow of funds. The Central Command, headed by the Grand Master, managed broad strategy and diplomacy and maintained correspondence with both the papacy and secular rulers. This administrative competence allowed the Templars to remain effective far from their castles, making them one of the best organized institutions of their day. The leadership, however, was human and contentious. Not every Grand Master possessed equal skill, and internal disputes occasionally surfaced over strategy, resource allocation, and the treatment of non-combatant communities. High office meant juggling the demands of donors, the needs of the fortress garrisons, the spiritual formation of the brothers, and relations with the papacy. Such complexity required diplomatic dexterity and a keen awareness of shifting political tides. As the crusading centuries progressed, the Templars' role intertwined with the politics of Europe in unexpected ways. They served as financiers to kings, managers of estates when heirs were absent, and guarantors of trade. Their houses and cities could stabilize local economies and support merchants with credit instruments. This integration into mundane affairs increased the order's prestige but also magnified its vulnerability to accusations of worldly ambition and financial manipulation. The later 12th and 13th centuries saw the order's iconography and rituals become richer and, in some quarters, more contested. The red cross on a white mantle was a public sign of vow and sacrifice, but cloistered practices and esoteric rites were whispered about in taverns and courts. Charges of heterodox worship, though rarely substantiated outside coerced confessions decades later, became part of the folklore that would later be used as evidence against them. Reputation, once a shield, could in time be turned into a weapon. Meanwhile, the Muslim polities facing the Crusader states were not static. They adapted and, in many places, unified under astute rulers who exploited European disunity. The Mamluks of Egypt, emerging as a dynamic military force, posed a new and ferocious challenge to the Latin states. Their military efficiency and strategic acumen made them formidable foes, and their campaigns in the late 13th century would precipitate the collapse of many Christian strongholds. The loss of Acre in 1291 marked a dramatic turning point. Acre had been the linchpin of Latin presence in the Levant, and its fall signaled the effective end of Crusader territorial power in that region. For the Templars, whose identity and raison d'etre were tied to the defense of the Holy Land, this loss forced a profound rethinking. Their castles in the east fell one by one, and the order had to relocate, adapt, and reassert purpose in a Europe that was changing under its feet. In those years, many Templars moved to Cyprus and other islands, trying to maintain a toehold from which crusading aspirations might be renewed. Yet their military role clearly needed recalibration, and their European houses assumed more central importance as revenue centers and recruitment hubs. The brothers remained a martial order in spirit, but with the collapse of territorial holdings, their patrimony and their claims to unique authority were more exposed to scrutiny. Kingdoms in Europe were consolidating centralized authority, and monarchs were increasingly assertive about taxation, jurisdiction, and control of financial flows. In France, Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, faced fiscal strains and political contests that tested royal coffers. The crown's need for money, combined with a desire to assert influence over sources of power, created conditions in which the Templars' wealth and autonomy were burdensome and potentially useful targets. Philip's dispute with the papacy and his complicated financial entanglements with the order made the Templars vulnerable. By 1307 he had the motive and the will to act decisively. On October 13th of that year, a date marked in grim memory, royal agents arrested scores of Templars in France on charges ranging from heresy and idolatry to obscene initiation rites. The arrests were swift and brutal, and they set in motion a legal and ecclesiastical drama that would rattle Europe. Accusations against the Templars were, in many ways, tailored to the moment. Confessions extracted under torture told lurid stories of secret ceremonies and denials of Christ, while contemporary observers debated the validity of such evidence. The methods used by inquisitors and the political pressures applied by Philip cast a long shadow over the proceedings. The question of whether the charges reflected genuine corruption or a political effort to seize assets remains contested and complex. Pope Clement V, newly in place and cautious in the face of French royal pressure, found himself trapped between loyalty to papal protection for a favorite order and the forceful claims of a powerful monarch. The papacy's position was compromised by political dependency and the nuanced legalities of jurisdiction. In 1308 and the years that followed, papal commissions investigated the matter, and the trials unfolded with a mixture of canonical procedure and royal intimidation. Many Templars confessed when subjected to torture, and those confessions fed a narrative that provided moral and legal grounds for action. Yet others recanted when not under duress, and some maintained their innocence to the end. The moral confusion of these proceedings made it difficult to reach simple judgments. Historians have long argued over the reliability of the records. Coercion produced testimonies that served the aims of inquisitors and kings alike, leaving the truth clouded by pain and politics. The suppression of the order did not occur uniformly across Christendom. While France acted decisively, other realms responded cautiously, and many kings were reluctant to seize Templar property for fear of papal wrath or popular unrest. The papacy finally moved in 1312 with the Bull Vox in Excelso, which formally dissolved the order. The text forbade the continuation of the order and transferred many of its properties to the Hospitallers, though local implementation varied and disputes over assets persisted. The fate of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, became emblematic of the tragedy. Arrested, tried, and condemned in a process that mixed legal formality with brutal coercion, he was burned at the stake in 1314 after retracting forced confessions and proclaiming the innocence of his brethren. The image of a dignified leader executed in a storm of political vindictiveness has fueled centuries of reflection and myth, and the moment has been remembered as both a moral outrage and a tragic close to an era. Despite formal suppression, rumors of Templar survivals and hidden treasures proliferated. Some former members integrated into other orders or returned to lay life, others disappeared into private networks. The order's architectural legacy, churches, preceptories, and fortresses remained as tangible reminders of an epoch. Their legal innovations, financial practices, and military doctrines also persisted, absorbed by other institutions or echoed in new forms of organization. Beyond the immediate legal fate of the order, the Templars' cultural afterlife is remarkable. In subsequent centuries, they were romanticized in literature, painted as heroic defenders of Christendom or cast as shadowy conspirators in fevered imagination. Freemasonry and other modern movements later claimed symbolic links to the Templars, weaving legends that conflated ritual, secrecy, and moral renewal. These narratives often say more about later societies' needs for origin myths than about medieval reality. Scholars today sift the records with nuanced tools, separating administrative documents from polemic and weighing confessions obtained under torture against material evidence. The Templars' archives, scattered and often destroyed, still yield fragments that illuminate daily life, fiscal arrangements, and the logistics of castle life. Archaeology at sites like the Temple Church in London and the ruins of Croix de Chevaliers provides tangible context for the textual record, showing how an order built and lived in stone and soil. What remains striking is the order's hybrid nature, neither purely monastic nor merely martial. Their existence challenged conventional categories and conceived of Christian service in a form that required both prayerful interiority and ruthlessly practical skills. This synthesis proved compelling for contemporaries and alarming for some authorities, for it expanded the imagination of what religious life could mix with worldly expertise. The Templars' innovations in finance deserve particular attention. Their early experiments in safe deposit and negotiation anticipated modern practices of credit and fiduciary responsibility. Merchants and nobles who relied on Templar networks discovered a trust that was institutional rather than personal, backed by the order's reputation and legal immunities. Those same features, which facilitated international commerce, also made the Templars a tempting target for fiscal extraction by states under pressure. Architecturally, the round churches associated with the order recalled the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and the idea of sacred geometry. The Temple Church in London, with its circular nave, dramatized the order's claim to a sacred legacy and its orientation toward Jerusalem. Such buildings were not merely houses of worship, they were statements of identity, arranging space in ways that invoked biblical memory and military symbolism at once. The Templars' code of conduct, public piety, communal ownership, and readiness for combat held internal tensions. Poverty at the communal level could coexist with an impressive material base. Vows of chastity did not preclude the hard realities of patrols, sieges, and contact with local populations. Maintaining spiritual discipline in an environment saturated with violence required continual effort, confession, and the pastoral care of priests embedded within the order. In the Levant, the order's relationships with local Christian communities and with Muslim neighbors were variegated. At times, Templars formed alliances with local Christian princes and negotiated truces with Muslim rulers when that served mutual interest. On other occasions, they clashed fiercely, embodying the religious polarization of the era. These interactions were shaped by immediate concerns, supply lines, the safety of pilgrims, and the shifting fortunes of war. The Templars' story is inseparable from the larger tale of the Crusades, the initial burst of religious zeal, the militarization of pilgrimage, the transplantation of European institutions into the Levant, and the slow, painful contraction that culminated in the end of Latin territorial control. Their promise and their peril were bound up in the same dynamic, the conviction that martial force could serve a sacred purpose, and the risk that such force, if unchecked, could draw the order into secular entanglements it could not escape. Over the longue durée, the order came to be remembered as a symbol of chivalric devotion and of institutional daring. Their castles still dominate landscapes, their churches survive as places of worship repurposed by modern congregations, and their legal precedents ripple through the history of international institutions. The idea that a supranational organization could answer to spiritual authority while managing material wealth was a prototype for later international enterprises, both religious and secular. Yet it is important not to romanticize or to demonize simplistically. The Templars were products of their time, spiritual men who fought wars, administrators who amassed wealth to sustain missions, and individuals who sometimes succumbed to human faults. They enacted noble and brutal actions in equal measure, motivated by sincere belief, ambition, duty, and necessity. Any study that flattens them into a single category misses the complexity that made them historically consequential. Their dissolution left legacies that were practical and symbolic. Hospitallers assumed many properties and took over some responsibilities in places where Templars had once been dominant. The centralization of papal power and the rise of national monarchies altered the balance between ecclesiastical privilege and royal prerogative, a shift that had implications well beyond the fate of any single order. The trials and their aftermath taught rulers new methods for appropriating ecclesiastical wealth and neutralizing institutions that opposed sovereign aims. In popular memory, the Templars have become a canvas on which later ages paint their anxieties and aspirations. 19th century Romanticism found heroic knights and tragic martyrdom. 20th century novels turned them into guardians of secrets. Modern conspiracy theories turned them into architects of hidden power. For historians, the challenge is to separate these layers of myth from archival fact while acknowledging why myths endure and what they reveal about the societies that invent them. Understanding the order requires attention to both macro-level structures and intimate details. The organization's success depended as much on the discipline of individual brothers, on their practice of prayer at dawn, the clinking of armor in the courtyard, the meticulous account books kept in candlelight, as on grand strategies and papal bulls. Ordinary moments of care, training, and stewardship compounded over decades to produce an enterprise whose scale was unusual for its time. The Templars' iconography, the red cross sewn onto white wool, remains one of the most recognizable symbols of the medieval West. It spoke of sacrifice and identity, of a willingness to stand apart in a distinctive, ostentatious simplicity. For contemporaries who saw them in the field, the sight of that mantle meant reassurance. For critics, it could mean the concentration of power in a semi-autonomous force. Symbols have the power to simplify complex realities, and the Templars' colors distilled a complicated institution into an emblem that was easy to read and easy to contest. Even in defeat, the order's intangible legacies persisted. Military engineering techniques developed and honed at their castles influenced castle design across Europe. Administrative practices refined in the order's chanceries informed the management of estates and royal finances. The notion of an organization that could transcend national boundaries under a single spiritual authority would recur in different forms, from companies to religious federations, and would inspire debate about the proper limits of ecclesiastical independence. At its core, the Templars' story is about the negotiation between sacred vocation and worldly necessity. The order arose because piety demanded protection, and protection required resources and organization. In negotiating that tension, the Templars innovated and adapted in ways that made them both admired and feared. Their rise and fall illustrate how institutions formed under extraordinary circumstances can come to exercise enormous influence, and how such influence can provoke the anxieties that end them. The human drama is abiding. Men took vows motivated by faith and by adventure, died in sieges that tested families and neighbors, and left behind letters that reveal fraught negotiations and tender pastoral concerns. The archives hold pleas from commanders about shortages, inventories listing horses and harness, and pleas from donors who worried about the salvation of their souls. These everyday records shade the grand narratives and give us access to the lived world behind the legend. To listen closely to their history is to feel the texture of a medieval world shifting its assumptions about war, piety, finance, and the limits of institutional power. It reminds us how innovation can be both a blessing and a liability. The Templars' institutional achievements were real, tangible contributions to medieval society, even as their concentration of wealth and autonomy proved politically combustible in a changing Europe. In the centuries that followed, the story of the Templars kept finding fresh audiences because it poses questions that remain urgent. How should religious conviction inform the use of force? How can international institutions be held accountable, and what is the proper relationship between spiritual obedience and worldly stewardship? The Templars were an experiment in answering these questions with organization, vows, and a willingness to risk everything for a cause that they believed was holy. Standing now before the ruined arches and the surviving round churches, it is hard not to sense the mixture of aspiration and hubris. The Order of the Temple sought to enact a radical synthesis, a brotherhood devoted to God and skilled in arms, a supranational network of sanctified administrators and financiers. They achieved remarkable things in military, economic, and spiritual realms, and their downfall warns against the hazards that accompany public power and concentrated wealth. Their story, as much as any medieval saga, is a mirror. It reflects the virtues of courage, discipline, and devotion, and the vices of greed, secrecy, and political overreach. It teaches how institutions can grow beyond their original purpose lest they be reshaped by external pressures. And it leaves us with a final irony: an order founded to protect pilgrims and holy places itself became the subject of a trial that pilgrims of conscience might have worried about in earlier times. In the end, the Templars remain an emblem of a world in motion, a chapter in the long story of Europe's encounter with the Near East, and a case study in how religious ideals translate into worldly institutions. Their rise was swift, their governance complex, and their fall thunderous. Yet the traces they left, stone, parchment, law, and legend, continue to speak across the centuries, asking us to listen, to question, and to reflect on the costs and consequences of organizing sacred purposes into earthly power. When we return our gaze to the small band of knights who first mounted their steeds to guide pilgrims, the roots of everything that followed become clearer. Those beginnings were humble, defined by vows and by the fragile hope of a safe road. From such modest origins came an institution that would reshape economics, warfare, and international law. The story of that transformation is long, tangled, and instructive, a narrative of faith meeting practical necessity that refuses to be reduced to a single moral. So we move from the pilgrim trails to the ramparts, from whispered sermons in medieval cloisters to the clatter of sword and saddle, and through every stage the Templars adapted and reinvented themselves. They responded to crises with organizational creativity and to prosperity with administrative sophistication. Their strengths were many and evident, their vulnerabilities, when pressed, proved fatal. Yet even in their suppression they influenced the course of European institutions and the imagination of later ages. History leaves us with questions as provocative as the documents it preserves. Were the charges against them primarily political, or did cultural changes within the order provide genuine grounds for reproof? How much of their wealth derived from prudent stewardship, and how much from the extraction of resources that by themselves generated resentment? The answers are rarely simple, but seeking them illuminates the tangled relationship between faith, power, and survival across centuries. If one listens to the long echo of the Templars, one hears more than the clank of armor or the murmur of prayer. One hears negotiations of identity, the crafting of legal instruments that crossed borders, and the anxieties of rulers who felt their authority threatened. One hears also the human voices who recorded their lives in ledgers, letters, and confessions, leaving a mosaic of testimony that both clarifies and complicates our understanding. Subscribe if you too would have dared to walk among the Templars, crossing borders of power and secrecy to leave your own mark on history. Their narrative continues to be retold because it speaks to perennial human concerns, the desire to serve something larger than oneself, the temptation of wealth, the burden of power wielded in the name of faith. The Templars achieved extraordinary things and made grave missteps, and their history offers material for reflection about how communities organize themselves in the name of higher goals. In that reflection we find lessons about prudence, accountability, and the risks of mixing sacred duties with worldly authority. Listening across the centuries, we are reminded that great institutions are built by ordinary acts repeated faithfully: the discipline of prayer, the management of stores, the training of recruits, and the letters sent asking for aid. The Templars multiplied such acts into a global presence, and their story asks us to recognize the cumulative force of small, steady practices. It is a history of how routine devotion can transform the political and spiritual landscape of an age. Finally, the origins of the Templars, their birth out of a crusading moment and their rise to a holy order, teach us that institutions emerge in answer to felt needs and available means. The medieval world needed guardians for pilgrims and found in knights with vows a workable answer. What began as a practical solution to a dangerous road became something larger, a revolutionary blending of monastic discipline and martial function. The consequences of that blending were vast, complex, and enduring. To follow the story of the Templars from their founding on the Temple Mount to their suppression in Europe is to traverse a landscape of devotion and ambition, ingenuity and violence, sanctity and scandal. It is to watch an experiment in holy governance blossom and then be cut down by the converging currents of politics, fiscal pressure, and rumor. Their legacy is a testament to the creative energies of the medieval church and the fragile balance required when spiritual goals are given worldly instruments. And so the white mantles and red crosses remain in the memory of history and imagination alike, symbols of an order that sought to make the world safer for pilgrims and found itself entangled in the complexities of power. Their rise from crusade to holy order was dramatic and transformative, their fall a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities of institutions that hold both spiritual claims and worldly riches. In listening to their long story, we learn about courage and error, about the making and unmaking of an ideal, and about the ways in which human endeavors destined for the sacred can slip into the realm of the perilously human. The story begins in a landscape of dust and prayer, where the idea of a brotherhood of warriors dedicated to the protection of pilgrims took shape after the First Crusade. Men swore themselves to a harsh life, trading the comforts of home for the white mantle and the red cross, stepping into a world where faith and martial skill would be braided together. What started as a handful of knights under Hugues de Payens would grow into one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Christendom, altering economies, fortifying frontiers, and shaping politics for 2 centuries. Their rise was neither sudden nor isolated. It was the product of circumstance, ambition, and an age eager for new forms of spiritual and temporal authority. Hugues de Payens and a small band of companions arrived in Jerusalem around 1119 with a single, sharp purpose: to protect pilgrims making the perilous journey to the Holy Sepulchre. The kingdom of Jerusalem was fragile, and pilgrims moving between ports and shrines were easy prey for bandits and raiders. These knights formed a brotherhood that combined monastic discipline with military readiness, cloaking their enterprise in vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while keeping a vigil on the roads. That blend of sacred mission and armed force was the seed that would allow the order to flourish beyond anything its founders could have imagined. Early survival depended on patronage, and the Templars found a powerful advocate in Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian reformer whose sermons gave them a moral and spiritual legitimacy. Bernard's endorsement was not merely rhetorical. He framed the knights as a new ideal, a perfect fit for a Christendom seeking martial expressions of piety. His letter to European nobility and the papacy helped secure recognition, and in 1129 the Council of Troyes formally approved the order, giving it a rule modeled on monastic life but adapted for military purpose. That papal and ecclesiastical blessing created a legal and moral foundation that separated them from ordinary knights, and magistral created a network of supporters across Europe eager to contribute. From that moment, the Templars were not only warriors in the East but an institutional presence across medieval Europe, with preceptories and houses rising in towns and countryside alike. Donations poured in, land and income from nobles seeking spiritual favor, relics and chapels from those grateful for delivered pilgrims, and entire villages given in gratitude or as part of pious wills. Each donation reinforced a growing web of economic assets, and as the Templars learned to manage these holdings, their resources expanded beyond the expectations of a modest protective force. They evolved into landowners, managers, and financiers, a transformation that would power their castles and fund their campaigns. Their rule, the Latin rule, set the tone for daily life and governance, combining liturgical obligations with military training and administrative duties. Men lived under a strict timetable of prayer and service, waking to matins and lauds, balancing communal worship with exercises of arms. The hierarchy was precise, the Grand Master at the top, supported by marshals, seneschals, and treasurers, while preceptors ran provincial commanderies that supplied men and funds to the east. That structure made it possible to coordinate far-flung resources, and the regularity of their organizational systems was as crucial to their rise as any battlefield victory. Wealth, however, followed opportunity. The Crusader states in the Levant were constantly strapped for manpower and money, and the Templars filled both gaps. They accepted donations that included cash, wine, farms, mills, and rents from Europe, and they began to accumulate diverse portfolios of income. Over time, those holdings turned the order into a sophisticated economic actor, able to support castles, maintain cavalry, pay soldiers, and even lend money to kings. The paradox of medieval religiosity is that piety and profit often walked hand in hand. For the Templars, the means of defending the holy places required capital, and capital produced influence. Commanderies across Europe functioned as the order's administrative and economic arteries, each a center of collection and distribution. Peasants tilled their lands, collecting the rents that flowed to central granaries and treasuries, while urban houses handled more liquid assets, trade, and correspondence. The Templars developed techniques of account keeping, inventories, and charters to track their assets, and their seals and documents began to populate the archives across kingdoms. Practical management of these properties demanded expertise and trust, and the order cultivated captains, stewards, and clerks who could run estates with surprising efficiency. Around the castles that guarded the eastern frontier, their architectural genius emerged as both symbol and instrument of power. The Templar castle was designed to withstand sieges and to control roads, passes, and coastal approaches. Massive curtain walls, concentric defenses, and carefully sited towers created fortresses that were difficult to reduce by force. They carved cisterns into bedrock, laid out inner wards for horses and men, and built chapels at the emotional center of these strongholds, where religion and arms merged into a single experience. These castles were not just military bases, they were statements of permanence and sovereignty in a volatile borderland. Croix de Chevaliers, though most closely associated with the Hospitallers, represents the kind of monumental fortress culture that the Templars both admired and emulated in their own holdings. Castles like Gaza, La Roche, and others functioned as bases for patrols, forward posts for expeditions, and refuges for local populations in times of danger. The Templars understood that control of terrain meant control of commerce and pilgrimage, and by fortifying strategic locations they could exert influence over trade routes and inland corridors. With every tower and barbican, their footprint grew larger in the map of the East and the imaginations of chroniclers back in Europe. Their economic reach extended into the mechanisms of medieval finance, where they pioneered services that resembled banking within the constraints and theology of the age. Pilgrims and nobles could deposit valuables in a European house and receive a letter of credit to withdraw funds in the Levant, a practice that conserved precious coin while protecting travelers from theft. The Templars sometimes acted as custodians for royal treasuries, moving funds across dangerous seas and lands, an activity that increased both their wealth and their political significance. The moral and legal flexibility they enjoyed, exemptions from local taxes and direct papal protection, allowed them to operate across borders in ways that secular authorities could not match. Such privileges, granted by papal bulls and royal charters, created a quasi-sovereign entity. The Templars answered primarily to the Pope, not to local bishops or kings, and that autonomy allowed for rapid expansion without the interference of feudal obligations. Exemptions multiplied, allowing them to collect tithes, to found churches, and to hold property in perpetuity. These immunities were crucial in turning spiritual capital into practical power, but they also fostered envy and suspicion among secular rulers and local clergy who saw an ever-growing competitor in their midst. Power, inevitably, breeds rivals. The order's internal culture balanced ascetic piety with martial camaraderie, producing a distinctive identity that members carried into courtly circles. The white cloak marked them as imitators of Christ, their red cross signifying martyrdom and sacrifice, and that visual language resonated in an age that valued outward signs of devotion. Recruits came from noble houses seeking glory or salvation, and the order offered a path where service and sanctity could be combined. Training included horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the use of lances, but it was governed by a spiritual discipline that kept the brotherhood connected to prayer and ritual. Their influence in courts across Europe was not solely military. Kings and princes often relied on Templars as advisors, guarantors of loans, and intermediaries in diplomatic affairs. Their network made them ideal arbiters for cross-border disputes, and monarchs valued their capacity to mobilize men and money quickly. The Templars, in turn, cultivated relationships with the elite, accepting donations from nobles who sought spiritual benefits and political advantage. As their network spread, so too did their ability to shape outcomes in the affairs of states, both great and small. The politics of the Crusader states were a constant arena where Templar ambitions and royal prerogatives collided and converged. In Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli, the order negotiated with kings, vassals, and merchants, sometimes serving as the backbone of defense and sometimes creating tensions by acting as a power broker. Their force of arms could make or break a campaign, and their sieges and counter-raids were often decisive in the fluid wars of the Levant. Yet their independence and occasional friction with secular rulers created a delicate balance of mutual dependence and rivalry that would define much of their political life. The Templars were also innovators in logistics and supply, understanding that knights needed more than valor to fight. They needed forage, stable supplies, and steady cash. Their caravans moved provisions across inhospitable terrain, and their ships, while never a navy in the modern sense, transported men, horses, and grain across the Mediterranean. This logistical capacity meant that they could sustain protracted sieges and maintain far-flung garrisons, turning vulnerabilities into predictable patterns of supply and demand. Logistics was the invisible engine behind their military power and the quiet reason their castles could endure while armies came and went. The order's commitment to secrecy, more a product of discipline and tradition than obscurantism, led to myths that would later feed darker suspicions. Rituals in chapter houses, the passwords and signs used in a pre-modern security culture, and the closed nature of commanderies all lent a secretive aura to the order. To contemporaries, the secrecy was simply part of the military ethos, but in later centuries arid imaginations would transform disciplined privacy into accusations of heresy and conspiracy. For the men within, secrecy served practical ends: operational security, protection of assets, and the unity of command. Templar knights and sergeants distinguished themselves on the battlefield with a characteristic combination of heavy cavalry charges and disciplined infantry support. Their cavalry tactics relied on shock and cohesion, heavily armored horsemen charging in tight formations to break enemy lines. They relied on disciplined command structures and a reputation that often intimidated opponents before swords crossed. When pitched battles favored cavalry, the Templars could be decisive, but in the diverse military landscape of the Levant, adaptability and logistics were often more determinative than pure battlefield heroics. Beyond their combat role, the Templars functioned as custodians of sacred spaces and relics, taking stewardship seriously and investing in the spiritual infrastructure of the Crusader states. Chapels within castles, altars in urban houses, and the careful preservation of relics were part of their identity, and they often maintained liturgical staffs and clerical members to serve spiritual needs. This religious dimension deepened their moral claim to the tasks they performed and tied their existence to the broader ecclesiastical mission of Christendom. It was both symbolic and practical. Piety justified warfare, and warfare funded piety. The Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights were both collaborators and competitors in a network of military orders that shared similar origins but different priorities. The Hospitallers focused more on care and hospital work at first, then grew into a military power. The Teutonic Knights focused on northern crusading in the Baltic. Competition for donations and recruits sometimes led to rivalry, but cooperation against common foes was common as well. Together these orders formed a system of militarized piety that the papacy could rely on to project Christian force beyond the immediate control of secular princes. As the Templars accumulated castles and land, they developed a complex legal culture to manage disputes and contracts across jurisdictions. Their charters and cartularies preserved agreements with kings, churches, and local lords, while their internal courts adjudicated matters within the brotherhood. The order created a language of legal privilege that allowed them to bypass local customs and enforce uniform standards across regions. They became, in effect, a transnational corporation with its own legal apparatus, a powerful, self-regulating institution that could defend its interests in war and law alike. The Order's global network thrived in part because it recruited across borders and integrated diverse nobles into its ranks, creating a cosmopolitan brotherhood for the medieval world. A French noble might find himself serving alongside an Iberian knight or Scandinavian squire, united by a common rule and mission. This cosmopolitan character made the order resilient and adaptable, and it allowed for cross-pollination of tactics, administrative practices, and devotional life. It also meant that fortunes in one region could be marshaled in another more rapidly than local feudal systems allowed. With wealth came investments in culture and patronage. The Templars supported churches, commissioned works of art, and endowed chapels whose stained glass, altarpieces, and liturgical objects reflected their status. Their patronage extended into Europe's towns and abbeys, where their symbols appeared on tombs and memorials, marking their benefactions. Such cultural investments enhanced prestige, creating a visual language of sanctity and authority that reinforced their social standing. Behind the stone and stain of patronage lay a deliberate strategy to shape memory and sanctify influence. Architectural records and archaeological finds reveal the sophistication of Templar construction, from robust foundations to carefully designed water systems. Cisterns carved in rock with channels that fed reservoirs, kitchens arranged to serve hundreds, and vaulted storerooms insulated against siege conditions all spoke to advanced engineering for medieval times. Far from being ad hoc military encampments, Templar castles were long-term investments designed for endurance, reflecting a capacity to plan for decades and to endure hardship when supply lines were threatened. Their buildings embodied strategy as much as craftsmanship. Their maritime activities became integral as well, since control of ports and sea lanes meant control of commerce and reinforcement. The Templars chartered ships and established houses in key ports from Marseille to Acre, employing sailors who understood Mediterranean trade winds and the politics of harbor fees. Naval transport ensured the mobility of knights and material, and in turn reinforced the order's capacity to respond to crises with a speed few medieval institutions could match. Sea power was a quiet complement to fortification and finance, knitting the Templars into the wider economy of the Mediterranean. The relationship between the Templars and secular rulers was a complicated dance of mutual dependence and rivalry. Monarchs valued the order's military muscle and creditworthiness, but they resented its independence and occasional refusal to bow to royal prerogatives. The Templars acted as a power center that could buttress or undermine sovereign aims, working for the preservation of Crusader states while also protecting the interests of European benefactors. This tension created a fraught political landscape where favors and hostilities could shift with changing kings and popes. Internal discipline was enforced through a combination of spiritual authority and military code, and the chapter house was the center of governance and correction. Offenses were adjudicated internally, penitential practices administered, and transfers of property approved by vote and seal. The regularity of these procedures maintained order within a large, decentralized institution and ensured that the Brotherhood could operate with cohesion even when its members were scattered across continents. Discipline was the glue that held a medieval multinational enterprise together. The Templars were not immune to scandal or failure, but their public image often masked the bureaucratic and petty disputes that riddle any large organization. Arguments over rights to a village, disputes about tithes, and conflicts between preceptors were common, and the minutiae of administration required constant attention. Chroniclers tended to record dramatic sieges and royal interventions, but the slow, messy work of estate management was equally central to their rise. Without careful bureaucratic labor, the order could not have sustained its castles or paid its knights. Pilgrims benefited from the Templars' infrastructure in concrete ways, for the order's protection made pilgrimage routes safer and more reliable. Prior to the Templars, pilgrims faced banditry, hostile lordship, and the hardships of travel in dangerous lands. The order's patrols, garrison castles, and hospitality houses provided safe passage and secure lodging, encouraging more pilgrims to journey and reinforcing the religious economy of the East. Economically, the increased movement of people stimulated trade and donations, which in turn funded further military presence, a feedback loop of devotion and defense. The Templars also invested in agriculture and rural economy, understanding that land could yield predictable incomes if properly managed. They reorganized estates to increase productivity, built mills and irrigation systems, and leased lands under contracts that secured steady revenue. These rural investments diversified income sources beyond tithes and one-time gifts, making the order less vulnerable to fluctuations in fortune. The attention to agricultural detail demonstrated their capacity to manage both war and peace as interdependent spheres of operation. Their record-keeping gave modern scholars a trove of material to reconstruct the medieval economy. Cartularies and financial rolls show transfer of properties and the minutiae of transactions. These documents reveal not only sums and donors but the social networks that sustained the order, the legal instruments they used, and the regional variations in practice. Reading those dry ledgers is to watch an economy in motion, rents collected, pledges honored, disputes settled, and resources marshaled to hold a fortress for another winter. Bureaucracy, it turns out, was as important as bravery. The order's presence reshaped urban landscapes too, as houses and cities served both economic and representational purposes. Templar houses often clustered near cathedrals and markets, integrating into the civic fabric and participating in urban commerce. Their chapels and vaults became sites of social engagement, and their officials negotiated with local magistrates over privileges and tolls. In cities, the Templars were visible and influential, able to affect trade and civic politics and present a mediating face between local and international interests. Templar heraldry and symbolism carried meaning across Christendom. The white mantle symbolized purity and the red cross martyrdom and sacrifice. That iconography made them instantly recognizable and gave their presence moral weight in a world where symbols communicated authority as effectively as armies. Seals and banners extended that language into legal and military contexts, marking documents as the product of a transnational power. The visual coherence of such symbols aided recruitment and donation, creating a brand of sanctified martialism that drew support. As the order matured, it accumulated not only land and castles but responsibilities that sometimes strained its capacity. Governing diverse holdings required regional adaptations and flexibility, while maintaining spiritual cohesion demanded consistent rituals and oversight. The Grand Master and the Council in Jerusalem struggled to align strategy with local realities, and tensions sometimes flared between those who sought aggressive military action and those who favored consolidation and defense. Managing these tensions was part of what kept the organization alive, but it also introduced fault lines that could be exploited by rivals. Relations with the Eastern Christian communities were complex, as the Templars often relied on local knowledge and manpower while pursuing a distinctly Western model of military organization. They employed local guides, negotiated with Armenian and Syriac princes, and adapted to the religious and cultural mosaic of the Levant. Sometimes mutual reliance produced cooperation, sometimes fundamental differences in theology and practice created friction. The Templars had to navigate these relationships patiently, relying on diplomacy as much as arms to secure supply chains and local support. Over time, political dynamics in Europe influenced decisions in the Levant in ways that the order could not fully control. Wars in France, England, and the Iberian kingdoms diverted resources and attention, and the shifting priorities of monarchs shaped the flow of reinforcements and donations. European politics thus exerted a centrifugal force on Crusader logistics, and the Templars often bore the consequences of decisions taken thousands of miles away. Their power depended on consistent support from Europe, and when that support wavered, so too did the foundations on which their castles stood. The order's role as bankers to kings and nobles sometimes brought them into precarious positions when debts and political squabbles intersected. Lending to monarchs was profitable but risky, and the political cost of default or coercion could be severe. Kings who found themselves indebted to the Templars sometimes resented the order's ability to influence finances and policy. That resentment would, in certain eras, harden into active hostility, and the order's accumulation of capital would become the very ground on which later accusations would be leveled. Relations with popes were mostly favorable throughout the order's rise, as the papacy benefited from having a military arm that could be mobilized in the name of Christendom. Papal privileges cemented the order's autonomy, and Grand Masters cultivated favorable ties with curial officials. Yet popes, too, were subject to political pressures and occasionally had to balance the order's interests against those of powerful monarchs. The papal imprimatur that seemed to guarantee the Templars' security could shift with the winds of broader political expediency. The Templars' social footprint extended into charitable endeavors as well, for the order maintained hospitals and engaged in relief that aligned with their original mission of protecting the vulnerable. They provided shelter and care for pilgrims and wounded soldiers, and the presence of a Templar hospital in a city meant a certain standard of care and a moral claim that reinforced public support. Charity reinforced their spiritual legitimacy and provided a soft power to complement their martial strength. Tensions with local clergy sometimes emerged, especially when the order's exemptions and privileges competed with the diocesan authority of bishops. Bishops noticed the erosion of tithes and fees that might otherwise have bolstered local churches, and the Templars' independent legal status could frustrate ecclesiastical oversight. Negotiations and papal adjudication often resolved such disputes, but the underlying friction never completely vanished. The order's capacity to bypass local church structures made it simultaneously powerful and resented in the ecclesiastical landscape of medieval Europe. Their international courts and adjudicative mechanisms became models for later corporate and ecclesiastical law, demonstrating how a transnational institution might govern itself while spanning multiple legal cultures. The Templars developed methods for arbitration, record-keeping, and appeals that prefigured bureaucratic practices in later centuries. Their legal system managed everything from property disputes to accusations of misconduct within the order, maintaining a sense of internal justice that paralleled their military discipline. These structures were essential to sustaining a network whose members were dispersed and whose interests were interdependent. Templar recruitment was a social process tied to family legacy and aristocratic obligation, with younger sons of nobles often drawn to the order as a career that promised honor and the possibility of spiritual merit. Families bequeathed estates and negotiated patronage in exchange for the hope of remembrance and prayers, embedding the Templars into the life cycles of Europe's noble classes. The order's social network was thus reinforced through kinship ties and noble ambition, ensuring a steady flow of recruits capable of maintaining its martial and administrative demands. The training of novices combined liturgical instruction with military instruction, reflecting the hybrid character of the institution. New members learned to read the Latin office, to observe fasting and prayer, and to swear the specific vows of the order while also learning horsemanship and the maintenance of weaponry. This dual training created a disciplined, well-rounded brotherhood whose members were adept in both the prayerful and the practical tasks required by their mission. It was a life of regimented hours and steady obligations, where spiritual exercises and martial drills formed a single daily rhythm. Templar marshals and masters of horse oversaw the logistical complexity of maintaining war horses and armaments, an often overlooked but vital task. These officers ensured that horses were shod, saddles repaired, and harnesses maintained, and they managed the fodder, stables, and farriers needed to keep cavalry effective. When a campaign began, the efficiency of the marshal's office could determine how many mounts arrived fit for battle, and in the medieval world, the quality of a cavalry unit often turned on the unseen labor of stables and smiths. Such practical competence rooted the Templars in the material realities of warfare. The order's correspondence network was remarkable, with letters and messengers traversing Europe and the Levant to coordinate finances, troop movements, and property affairs. These communications had to be secure, reliable, and timely, and the Templars developed a culture of record and dispatch that supported their global activities. Their archives became repositories of institutional memory, preserving instructions and precedents that guided local commanderies in times of uncertainty. The ability to manage information across distances was a critical component of their power. Contemporaries and chroniclers often debated the proper role of the military orders, and the Templars became a prism through which anxieties about violence, sanctity, and authority were refracted. Some admired them as paragons of holy war, while others worried about the mingling of monastic and martial ideals. Debates about the morality of using violence in God's name were not abstract. They shaped the order's recruitment, its doctrinal defenses, and its public image. The Templars navigated these debates with rhetoric and ritual, presenting themselves consistently as instruments of divine will. As the 13th century progressed, the political landscape shifted in ways that strained the Templars' capacities and altered the calculus of support. The loss of key positions in the Levant, changing alliances, and the sheer expense of maintaining outposts placed pressure on the order's finances. Meanwhile, the rise of centralized monarchies in Europe created new centers of power that could challenge the independent privileges the order had enjoyed. These slow transformations would eventually set the stage for conflicts that culminated in dramatic confrontation. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked a watershed, removing the last major foothold of Western Christendom in the Levant and forcing a painful reevaluation of military order's purpose. Without a territorial base in the East, the Templars faced questions about mission and identity. Some argued for a renewed crusading effort while others sought new roles in European politics. The loss of fixed bases compelled the order to lean even more heavily on its European estates and on diplomatic navigation among monarchs. The end of the Crusader states did not immediately spell doom, but it transformed the strategic context in which the order operated. Their role as bankers and landowners in Europe became more conspicuous after the fall of the Crusader states, making the order palpably wealthy in the eyes of kings and subjects. Property transfers continued, but the absence of an eastern theater of war made the Templar presence feel less obviously essential to the broader project of defending the holy places. As their economic profile increased, so did scrutiny and envy, and political adversaries began to look for ways to appropriate or neutralize the order's assets. Power that had once been seen as indispensable now appeared as a potential prize to be claimed. Ambition and misstep by secular rulers intersected in ways that would prove catastrophic. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, faced fiscal crises and a crown deeply in debt, and the Templars were prominent among his possible solutions. Philip's ministers eyed the order's wealth and its legal exemptions as resources for the crown, and the French monarchy's consolidation of authority made it increasingly bold in confronting institutions that had once been untouchable. The stage was set for a clash between royal power and transnational privilege that would have consequences beyond France's borders. Behind Philip's moves was a culture of political calculation and a willingness to exploit charges and law to seize assets. By 1307, Philip took decisive action, ordering the mass arrest of Templars in France on a single autumn day. The arrests were swift and brutal, with many knights tortured into confessions under duress and many more detained in conditions that undermined fair trial. Philip's campaign relied on a blend of legal theater, ecclesiastical pressure, and political resolve, turning decades of rumor and envy into a judicial catastrophe for the order. Accusations leveled against the Templars were dramatic and lurid: heresy, blasphemy, obscene ritual, and moral degeneracy. These charges, widely publicized, fed on existing anxieties about secrecy and wealth, and they were compounded by coerced confessions extracted under torture. In the medieval legal framework, such confessions were often decisive, and the French crown and its allies used them to build a case that would justify confiscation. Yet the reliability of these confessions is deeply suspect. The circumstances of interrogation and the political motives behind the prosecutions cast a long shadow over the proceedings. Papal response to Philip's campaign was complex, reflecting the Pope's precarious position between royal power and ecclesiastical independence. Pope Clement V, newly elected and politically threatened, found himself pressured to cooperate with the crown while also safeguarding papal prerogatives. Clement summoned the order to Rome for investigation, and under the weight of political expediency he eventually issued bulls that suppressed the order's activities by papal decree. The papal suppression was not a clean endorsement of Philip's methods, but it effectively dissolved the Templars' corporate personality under the pressure of political realities. The dissolution of 1312 by papal decree did not end the drama. Many Templars were imprisoned, tortured, or executed in the years that followed, the most dramatic being the burning of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, in 1314. De Molay's execution was emblematic, a public spectacle that signaled royal victory and the final unraveling of an order that had seemed invulnerable less than a decade earlier. The order's vast properties were reassigned in many instances to the Hospitallers, while other assets were absorbed into royal treasuries. The legal and material unraveling took years and left scars across Europe and the Levant. Historians have long debated Philip's motives and the truth of the charges, and modern scholarship tends to view the prosecution as politically motivated and legally fraught. The range of evidence, including letters, trial records, and papal correspondence, paints a picture of opportunism more than righteous justice. The Templars' financial and political prominence provided a tempting target for a crown in fiscal distress, and the legal machinery was adeptly used to render theft into sanctioned confiscation. It was a sobering example of how institutions, even those blessed by Pope and populace, could be undone by the concentrated will of a ruler. The fate of Templar property varied by region. In many places Hospitallers inherited their lands, while in others local lords and kings appropriated assets. Some preceptories continued under new administrations, and the transition could be messy and contested. The redistribution of Templar assets shifted the balance of landholdings and wealth within Europe, creating ripple effects in local economies and in the patronage networks of churches and towns. Materially, the legacy of their investments continued to shape landscapes and legal relationships for generations. Cultural memory proved resilient. The Templars who survived the purges, some absorbed into other orders, some dispersed to secular life, left behind a mystique that outlived the order itself. Stories of hidden treasure, secret rituals, and arcane knowledge proliferated in the centuries after the fall, fueled by fragments of truth and the fertile imagination of later writers. The narrative of a powerful order undone by royal greed became a potent symbol for various political and cultural agendas in later centuries. Myth-making began almost at the moment of dissolution, ensuring that the Templars would never truly vanish from European imagination. The transfer of Templar properties did not erase the administrative innovations they had introduced, and many of their financial and organizational practices influenced later institutions. The systems for coordinating estates, moving funds, and mobilizing men as an institutional force were lessons absorbed by states and other religious houses. The idea of a transnational organization with clerical privileges and military capability provided a model, both for emulation and for caution, in subsequent centuries. Even in dissolution, their institutional imprint proved durable. The modern era has often recast the Templars to suit contemporary myths, whether romantic, conspiratorial, or political. From chivalric revivalists to occult theorists, the Templars became a canvas onto which various desires and fears could be projected. Such reinterpretations, while culturally interesting, often obscure the rigorous historical realities of medieval life and the concrete administrative practices that sustained the order. Separating legend from archival record has been a task for historians who seek to understand not only what people imagine but what the Templars actually did. Archaeology has added layers of detail to our understanding of the order, revealing domestic arrangements, evidence of diet, and material culture that written records overlook. Excavations of commanderies and castles have unearthed pottery, coins, and structural remains that speak to daily life and economic connections. These finds humanize the Templars, showing not only their grand strategies but the everyday work of blacksmiths, cooks, and clerks who made the machine run. Material culture ties the documentary past to the lived experience of men who served in the order. Legally and canonically, the Templars' suppression offers a study in how medieval institutions could be dissolved through a combination of royal pressure and ecclesiastical sanction. The process highlighted the vulnerabilities of transnational organizations in a world of increasingly centralized monarchies, and it set precedents for later encounters between church and state. The dissolution was a cautionary tale about the limits of papal protection when faced with the pragmatic ambitions of kings. Institutional life in the Middle Ages, as elsewhere, remained subject to the shifting balances of power. Yet the memory of their castles, of the White Mantle and Red Cross, continued to influence chivalric identity long after the order ceased to exist. Knighthood itself was shaped in part by the model of the military orders, which blended piety and martial obligation in a way that resonated in medieval culture and beyond. Later orders and secular militaries drew on the symbolic capital that the Templars had helped create, even as the practical landscape of war and governance transformed in the later Middle Ages. The Templar legacy, therefore, extended into the very imagination of European martial virtue. In literature and art, the Templars served as dramatic figures, saints, villains, or tragic heroes, depending on the storyteller. From medieval chronicles to modern novels, their story has been retold and reimagined countless times, reflecting cultural anxieties and romantic longings. Their dramatic rise and precipitous fall make for a compelling arc, and their visual symbols are easily deployed in narrative and visual arts. The persistence of their image testifies to the emotional power of their historical narrative, a blend of sanctity, wealth, and doomed glory. Intellectual life within the order included theological reflection on the legitimacy of armed service in the cause of faith, and debates among clerics and soldiers touched on the moralities of war, property, and spiritual reward. These were not trivial matters in a medieval society that took questions of salvation seriously. The Templars had to justify, internally and externally, the harmonization of monastic vows with martial activity. Treatises, sermons, and rules articulated a theology of crusading that sought to anchor violence in the language of redemptive sacrifice. The intellectual underpinnings of their enterprise mattered because they provided moral justification for what might otherwise seem a contradiction. Their material culture included distinctive artifacts, seals, crosses, weaponry, and liturgical objects that symbolized authority and served everyday needs. Seals authenticated charters, crosses marked property and duty, and weapons represented both the literal and symbolic arsenal of the Brotherhood. When these artifacts appear in museum collections, they offer direct contact with the past, bridging centuries with objects once handled by knights and clerics. Material artifacts thus help reconstruct the textures of an order that was at once sacred, martial, and administrative. The memory of the Templars influenced monarchs and reformers who looked for models of discipline and loyalty. Some ruled empires with an eye to the order's centralized command, while others deployed the Templars as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unaccountable wealth. Their story was, and remains, a mirror held up to power, revealing both noble and ignoble elements in the politics of institutions. That ambivalence makes the Templars a perennial subject for reflection about how societies organize force and wealth in the name of higher causes. As a military force, their legacy included innovations in siegecraft, fortification design, and the use of combined arms that blended cavalry shock with defensive infantry tactics. Their castles influenced military architecture across the Mediterranean, and aspects of their tactical approach informed later medieval warfare. The integration of supply, intelligence, and fortification became a hallmark of their strategic thought, showing that medieval warfare was not solely about single acts of heroism but about sustained attention to logistics and position. These strategic legacies passed into broader military practice. The Templars' institutional archives, scattered and partial as they are, require careful reading to separate the routine from the exceptional. Chroniclers favored dramatic episodes, but the real story is often found in mundane records of rent rolls, witness lists, and inventories that show an organization deeply embedded in medieval social and economic systems. Those documents reveal the slow accretion of assets and the painstaking work of administration that underwrote their martial exploits. The order's power was built not simply on battlefield reputation but on steady, often tedious, economic and legal craftsmanship. Modern historiography has sought to recover the Templars from the fog of legend by re-examining these archives and situating the order within the economic, legal, and political contexts of medieval Europe. Scholars have traced the networks of donation, the legal instruments used to hold property across borders, and the social dynamics of recruitment and patronage. This work has produced a more nuanced view of the Templars as pragmatic actors who used the tools of their age, law, bureaucracy, and piety, to pursue clearly articulated goals. The complexity revealed in modern scholarship enriches our understanding of how such an extraordinary institution could arise and then be dismantled. The question of how an organization designed to be a mobile, spiritual army sustained itself for centuries leads us back to the key insight of their age, the fusion of faith and function. Piety provided justification, organization provided stability, and wealth provided means. Without one of these elements, the order could not have become the indispensable institution it was at its height. The careful intertwining of ritual, rule, and resource explains much of their resilience and also why their unraveling was so thorough when political winds shifted. In the end, the Templars remain a study in medieval contradiction, ascetics with castles, monks with swords, men who prayed at dawn and maintained accounts by sunset. That juxtaposition turned them into symbols of a particular historical moment when spiritual ambition could justify temporal power, and when transnational institutions could thrive in a fragmented political landscape. Their rise was a story of adaptation, innovation, and calculated piety, and their fall was a lesson in the fragility of privilege when exposed to concentrated royal will. Even today, the ruins of their commanderies and the scattered parchments of their archives invite us to imagine a world where faith financed fortresses and charity built armories. Each stone and document is a fragment of a larger story about how societies mobilize belief and resources for collective aims. The Templars' ascent to wealth, their construction of castles, and their influence across Christendom remain a remarkable episode in the history of medieval Europe. An episode that continues to fascinate because it illuminates the interplay of devotion, power, and human ambition. The narrative of the Templars is not merely a chapter in military or religious history, it is a lens on how institutions form, adapt, and eventually meet their limits. Their institutions show how rule and ritual can be harnessed to practical needs, and how clerical endorsement can create privileged spaces in broader social orders. They were an experiment in transnational governance that succeeded spectacularly for 2 centuries and then succumbed to the changing pressures of political consolidation and royal ambition. The arc of their history implicates both the brilliance and the vulnerability of medieval institutional innovation. Looking back from our vantage point, we see the Templars reflected in many modern concerns: the management of wealth, the accountability of institutions, and the relationship between spiritual ideals and worldly effects. Their story prompts questions about transparency, legal immunity, and the distribution of power that are still relevant. The medieval world they inhabited was different in many respects, but the tensions between private wealth and public authority, between religious mission and political interest, resonate across time. The Templars are thus not only a medieval phenomenon but a recurring theme in any society that blends moral authority with material resources. What remains, finally, are images and ruins, documents and debates, traces of an order that once stood at the crossroads of devotion and dominion. Their castles still puncture the landscape, their seals remain in archives, and the white mantles with the red cross linger in our cultural memory. The riches they amassed were redistributed, their members scattered, and yet their imprint on the medieval world endured. The story of their rise to power, through wealth, castles, and influence, offers a long, complex tale about the making and unmaking of a powerful institution in Christendom. The Templars' tale is a reminder that powerful institutions are built from ordinary things: gifts and wills, barns and stables, ledgers and seals, prayers and patrols. Each donation, each repaired wall, and each cautious letter contributed to a structure of power that changed the map of medieval influence. Their rise was the cumulative result of thousands of small decisions as much as of a few great battles, and that cumulative power explains why they mattered so profoundly in their age. To understand them is to appreciate the slow craft of institutional creation and the abruptness with which political tides can overturn even the most entrenched structures. Their place in medieval society was paradoxical and instructive. They were clerics and combatants, administrators and ascetics, a kind of hybrid that solved problems few others could. Their success lay in the pragmatic linking of spiritual authority to worldly tasks, and in the cultivation of networks that spanned kingdoms and cultures. The same features that underpinned their success, autonomy, wealth, and a broad international reach, also made them vulnerable when extreme power coalesced against them. Their story thus carries both the promise and the peril of mixing sanctity with sovereignty. Even as scholarship continues to refine the contours of their history, the Templars will remain a durable subject of fascination because their story is so capacious. It touches upon theology, economics, warfare, diplomacy, and the human longing for both meaning and security. They embodied the medieval quest to align earthly endeavors with heavenly goals, and their rise to prominence illustrates how powerful an idea can become when it is organized effectively and blessed by authority. Their legacy is somber and luminous all at once, a testament to human ingenuity and to the fragile scaffolding that supports even the greatest of institutions. In the slow accumulation of stones and texts, and the rituals performed at dusk and the calculations made at dawn, the Knights Templar left an intricate legacy that scholars, storytellers, and travelers continue to explore. Their castles, once the fulcrums of an Atlantic and Mediterranean network, remain magnetically evocative. Their archives, when pieced together, reveal the painstaking administrative work that supported campaigns and chapels alike. Through the interplay of wealth, architecture, and influence, the Templars carved a place for themselves in the history of Christendom that is as instructive as it is unforgettable. Understanding their trajectory, from humble guardians of pilgrims to custodians of wealth and builders of fortresses, requires attention to details both grand and mundane. It requires reading legal rolls alongside sermons, examining cisterns alongside chronicles, and listening to the echoes of liturgies that once filled stone halls. Only by taking in the full range of their activities can we appreciate how power was built in the medieval world and how it might be undone. The Templars' rise and fall remain an enduring study in the possibilities and perils of organized, sanctified power. Their history teaches us about the interplay of devotion and calculation, and it reveals how medieval institutions could harness both to achieve remarkable ends. The story of their ascent is a tale of strategic thinking, spiritual branding, and administrative competence, sustained by a dense network of patronage and protection. The subsequent unraveling speaks to the temper of power in a period when kings sought to consolidate authority and papal protection could be tested by political exigency. In every way, the Templars demonstrated that the mechanisms of wealth and influence are as central to history as the battles that capture the imagination. To listen to the story of the Templars is to enter a world where prayer and paymasters, chapels and castles are parts of the same breathing organism. Their rise to power emerged from the combination of moral energy and material acumen, and their influence spread through the careful management of hearts and holdings alike. Their monuments and manuscripts continue to speak, inviting us to examine the choices that produced an extraordinary medieval enterprise. In their stones and ledgers, the echoes of a vanished order still insist that we pay attention to how institutions are built and how they can be dismantled. When storytellers paint the Templars in broad strokes, they often miss the finer grain of daily life and administrative craft that made such an order possible. The quiet realities of estate management, clerical routine, and logistical ingenuity were the bedrock of their capability. Without such mundane labors, castles would stand empty and charitable claims would ring hollow. The rise of the Templars teaches that long-term power is rarely the product of dramatic spectacle alone. It is the result of disciplined, routine labor sustained over generations. And so the tapestry remains complex, an organization of prayerful men who mastered the arts of warfare and finance, who built fortresses and managed farms, who negotiated with popes and kings, and who ultimately succumbed to the changing tides of European politics. Their story is rich in detail and consequence, touching upon many strands of medieval life. The Templars' rise to power was both a material achievement and a spiritual enterprise, woven together in a pattern that remained influential long after their corporate identity was extinguished. Finally, the Templars remind us that history is a palimpsest, with layers of life and legend overriding and revealing each other in turn. Each ruin, each charter, each whispered rumor adds a layer to a complex narrative that resists simple moralizations. The Order's rise and the dramatic decline that followed are, in equal measure, a chronicle of medieval institutional ingenuity and of the ruthless possibilities of political power. The Knights Templar remain a monument to the interplay between faith and ambition, and their story continues to be told because it speaks to enduring questions about the uses and limits of power in human society. When the smoke and dust of the First Crusade settled over Jerusalem, a handful of men looked at the empty, bloodied streets and imagined something different from a wandering, lawless soldiery. They wanted order, sanctity, and the capacity to protect pilgrims who still came to the holy city seeking absolution and relics. Hugues de Payens and a small band of knights turned toward a life that mixed sword and psalm, binding themselves to poverty, chastity, and obedience while keeping sharpened steel close at hand. That decision produced a creature of paradox, a monastery that rode, an order that prayed, a brotherhood that fought with the focus of a religious community and the discipline of an army. The early years of that new body were humble and precarious, but they were also fertile in myth and promise. The men who formed the Knights Templar called themselves poor brothers who guarded the road to Jerusalem, and their white mantles, embroidered with the unmistakable Red Cross, began to appear on the roads and fortifications of Outremer. Their motto blended the rule of St. Benedict with martial codes. They were monks in chapel and cavalrymen on the plain. It is worth pausing to imagine them not as caricatures of piety or villainy, but as complex people whose lives threaded prayer, paperwork, and the thunder of battle. The Templars' origins are rooted in practical needs and spiritual energies that doled out equal measure of austerity and ambition. Pilgrims were being waylaid and killed, trade routes were precarious, and Christian control in the Levant depended on a handful of fortified towns and the confidence of donors back in Europe. The idea of a permanent, mobile force that took vows and swore to live simply while maintaining martial capacities appealed to nobles and bishops alike. Their humble headquarters in Jerusalem near the Temple Mount lent them a name and a halo. Proximity to a sacred site made them seem like historical actors sliding into prophetically ordained roles. From the outset, the Templars were shaped by external patrons and internal rules. The Council of Nablus and later the Council of Troyes gave them legitimacy, and the endorsement of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the age, transformed them from a small guard into a pan-European institution. Bernard wrote of them as instruments of divine will, and his eloquence helped attract recruits and endowments. With privileges granted by popes and kings, they expanded into a unique hybrid, clerical privileges and martial responsibilities fused under a single banner. Their internal structure was careful and hierarchized, because a disciplined order could withstand both military pressure and the temptations of wealth. At the top stood the Grand Master, the elected figure who combined spiritual guidance with strategic command. Beneath him were marshals and commanders who oversaw knights, sergeants, and chaplains. The sergeants were men of lower birth who performed much of the manual labor and fought as light cavalry or infantry. Commanderies across Europe functioned as provincial branches, funneling men, horses, money, and supplies to the east, and they also offered local social services and hospitality that knitted the order into lay society. Daily life in a Templar house folded the routine of monasticism into the logistics of warfare, a rhythm that could move from silent prayer to the clatter of harness and hoof. They observed the canonical hours, rising for matins and resuming work or instruction afterward, but prayer did not replace training. In the scriptorium, someone copied letters and preserved records, while armorers filed metal and squires polished breastplates. A healthy Templar cell was equal parts cloister and stable, its chapel scenting the air and its armory clanking with the day's business. To be a Templar required training that smoothed the transition from noble leisure to militant austerity. Young nobles who joined left behind estates and early claims to marital alliances. Instead, they were drilled in horsemanship, swordplay, lance work, and the rudiments of siegecraft. They learned to ride and fight in formation, to hold a shield wall, and to charge as a heavy cavalry unit whose momentum could decide a battle. But they were also taught humility, obedience, and how to read liturgical texts, because the order's soul was as important as its lance arm. The weapons and armor of the Templars tell part of their story in steel and leather. They fought with spears, straight swords designed for thrusting as well as hacking, and maces for breaking mail. Their horses, often massive destriers, were armored in padded or metal barding for shock charges. The white mantle with its red cross served not only as a visible symbol of their vows but as a psychological tool on the battlefield, a banner many knew and feared. As equipment improved over the 12th and 13th centuries, the order adapted, incorporating thicker mail, reinforcing helmets, and experimenting with tactics that balanced the heavy cavalry charge with dismounted fighting in sieges or narrow streets. Siege warfare became a craft Templars mastered alongside crusading kings and other military orders. Castles like Tortosa, Safed, and Chateau Pellerin were not mere stone piles but engineered centers of control, with curtain walls, concentric defenses, water cisterns, and angled towers. Templars learned to build, repair, and garrison these fortresses, and they developed tactics for both assault and defense, undermining walls, using trebuchets and mangonels, laying sapping galleries, and arranging archers on walls to shoot down attackers. The logistics of siege, stocking grain, maintaining siege engines, and rotating troops required bureaucratic skill as much as swordsmanship. The balance between pious observance and practical, even mundane tasks, is striking when you consider the order's infirmaries and hospitality. Templar commanderies often housed pilgrims and took care of wounded brethren, and their infirmaries were places where simple medical knowledge met the realities of battlefield trauma. Men learned to set bones, dress wounds, and care for infected injuries in a period when bacteriology was unknown and superstition was common. Even in the East, the Templars operated hospitals and offered sanctuary. Their concern for the sick and poor was a characteristic they shared with other monastic military orders. Religion was the lens through which they valued sacrifice, and rituals bound the brethren into a cohesive spiritual body. Mass was central. The Eucharist was a moment that rehearsed their identity as brothers in Christ and warriors of the cross. Chaplains provided confession, spiritual counsel, and liturgical leadership, and the order's rule emphasized both individual piety and collective worship. Their zeal could be fierce, at once a source of courage on the battlefield and a justification for brutal measures against enemies perceived as threats to pilgrims and the faith. As the Templars expanded, their role shifted from local guardianship to an international presence that touched economies, politics, and diplomacy. Their commanderies in Europe gathered donations of land and money, which were invested in farms, mills, and rental properties. The order's income allowed it to buy horses, armament, and to pay mercenaries when necessary, but the accumulation of wealth also created problems. That wealth made them indispensable allies and tempting targets, and the geographic reach of their holdings required administrators who could oversee vast estates from England to Hungary and from Portugal to Sicily. One of the Templars' most innovative contributions was a proto-banking system that eased travel for pilgrims and nobles alike. A pilgrim could deposit wealth in Europe and receive a letter of credit to be cashed in the Levant, a system that reduced the risk of robbery on dangerous highways. This practice grew into a more sophisticated operation: loans to monarchs, safekeeping of valuables, and the transfer of funds across borders using the order's network. Their financial power enhanced their strategic options and elevated them to a status that blurred ecclesiastical privilege with quasi-financial sovereignty. Their status as both a spiritual army and a financial network made them indispensable in times of peace as well as war, but it also made them accountable to multiple authorities. Popes granted them exemptions from local episcopal oversight, allowing them to report directly to Rome on many matters, a privilege that increased tensions with bishops and kings who resented their autonomy. The resulting friction set up the conditions for rivalry, and as their coffers and castles multiplied, so did envy and suspicion. In the Levant, the Templars were often at the center of the last gasps of Christian power in Outremer. They held key fortresses that served as forward bases for raids and defense, and they forged complicated relationships with the secular princes of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with the Crusader states of Antioch, Tripoli, and the Latin Patriarchate. The Templars could be friends one year and rivals the next, because politics in Outremer was a shifting landscape of alliances, dynastic claims, and competing military strategies. Their loyalty to the papacy sometimes aligned them with local rulers, but it also made them independent actors whose strategic decisions mattered. Battles like Montgessard and the tragic day of Hattin illustrate the extremes of their experience. At Montgessard in 1177 they participated in an audacious Christian victory against Saladin's forces, a moment that showcased tactical daring and spirited horse charges. Yet closed in the memory of all their triumphs is Hattin in 1187, where the Muslim commander Saladin annihilated the Crusader army, took Jerusalem, and dealt a blow from which the Latin East never fully recovered. Templars fought with desperation and honor, but at Hattin many of them were captured, killed, or stripped of their arms and turned into prisoners of war. The loss echoed through Europe and set the stage for a new urgency in crusading. The siege of Acre at the turn of the century illustrates both the order's resilience and the shifting nature of crusading warfare. Acre stood as a prize and a fortress that both sides wanted. For the Templars it became a center of prolonged struggle where engineering, diplomacy, and sheer endurance mattered. When supply lines faltered or reinforcements arrived, the outcome hinged on logistics as much as courage, and the Templars were as noted for their ability to feed, reinforce, and hold out as for their battlefield charges. Beyond battles and sieges, the Templars shaped landscapes across Europe with their commanderies and local institutions. A Templar commandery in rural France might include a chapel, stables, barns, vineyards, and a modest manor house. It might be run by a small community of brothers who managed serfs and tenants. These properties buttressed local economies, employed craftsmen, and created networks of loyalty that reached into towns and villages. For ordinary people living nearby, the Templars were employers, landlords, and sometimes spiritual neighbors as well. Their interaction with local populations in the Levant was diverse and sometimes contradictory. They guarded pilgrims from Europe, but they also engaged with local Christian communities, Muslim neighbors, and Jewish populations, often in ways shaped by necessity and pragmatism. Trade, diplomacy, and truces required negotiation and, at times, mutual respect. The Templars maintained supply lines, negotiated for peace, and engaged in everyday commerce with those who were not of their faith. This pragmatism was not always comfortable for those whose imaginations painted them as strictly Crusader zealots. Over the 12th and 13th centuries, the order's culture evolved in response to changing military realities and internal needs. Their recruitment broadened to include non-noble sergeants, chaplains from clerical ranks, and younger sons of minor nobility who sought meaning beyond inheritance struggles. The order's bureaucratic needs produced a cadre of clerks and stewards as literate as any monastery, recording transactions, managing inventories, and corresponding with patrons. The Templars became a social institution that offered careers, religious identity, and a pathway for mobility for men who sought a life defined by faith and arms. Tensions with other orders and local powers sometimes erupted into rivalry and competition. The Hospitallers, another military monastic order with a strong identity and a different emphasis on hospitality and care, often found themselves both ally and competitor to the Templars. The two orders could cooperate in defense of the coast or in joint expeditions, yet they also vied for resources, castles, and papal favor. This competition shaped the patterns of fortification and the politics of the Crusader states, adding another layer of complexity to the late medieval Levant. While the Templars cultivated religious life and martial excellence, they also accrued cultural capital in the form of seals, robes, heraldry, and liturgical objects that spoke to their hybrid identity. Their great seals, sometimes showing two knights on one horse, were symbolic of the order's vow of poverty and brotherly sharing, but also communicated a self-image of cohesion under restraint. Manuscripts illuminated by Templar scribes and relics kept in their chapels reflected an aesthetic that balanced austerity with the need for ceremonial presence. In these artifacts, the order's contradictions, spirit and power, poverty and wealth, found expression. Their legal and administrative reach stretched into royal courts, parliaments, and papal chancelleries, making them a force to be reckoned with when politics and finance entangled. Kings and princes borrowed money or placed garrisons at their disposal, and bishops contended for influence over properties that generated income for local dioceses. The Templars' legal privileges, tax exemptions, judicial autonomy in some cases, and direct papal oversight created friction and envy that festered in aristocratic corridors and royal treasuries. Public perception of the order varied according to social position and proximity to their activities. To some they were noble defenders of Christendom, to others they were foreign, aloof, and sometimes arrogant. Chroniclers praised their bravery and extolled their miracles. Rumormongers invented stories of secret rites and hidden treasures. This dual perception intensified as the order grew wealthier and more autonomous, making them both admired and resented in different quarters of medieval society. Templar imagery seeped into medieval literature, liturgy, and popular imagination, and that cultural afterlife continued long after their political power ebbed. Ballads and chronicles told of heroic deeds, of banners held high and knights who would not yield, while sermons sometimes critiqued the dangers of mixing wealth and sanctity. The knights became characters in stories of chivalry, moral exemplars in some tales, and cautionary figures in others. And this narrative ambivalence helped produce the myths that would later be recast by Romantic writers. The order's network also enabled a maritime presence that is often overlooked in discussions that focus on horses and castles. Templar ships carried men and supplies, protected pilgrim convoys, and occasionally engaged in naval combat or privateering. Their ports and shipyards were strategic assets, and control of sea lanes was as critical as the possession of fortresses inland. Maritime operations demanded different skills, navigation, provisioning, and gunnery that expanded the order's competence far beyond the rise and clash of lances. When the political tide turned against the Latin presence in Palestine, the Templars faced a strategic question: hold to the last fortress or conserve forces for future campaigns in Europe and the Mediterranean. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 and the slow erosion of territories imposed harsh choices, and sometimes the order responded by doubling down on fortification and fight. At other times, it tried to secure safer havens, reinforcing islands and ports that could sustain a naval and financial hinterland for a struggle that had gone global in scope. The 13th century brought new pressures and new opportunities that would eventually change the Order's face irrevocably. The loss of major strongholds, the shifting priorities of European monarchs, and the rise of new political structures conspired to reduce the Order's strategic significance in the East. Meanwhile, in Europe, their properties made them magnets of influence and wealth, and their agents engaged in credit relations with kings who occasionally borrowed against future revenues from old Crusader properties. Those loans created a dangerous closeness to royal treasuries and a vulnerability to fiscal exploitation. As the Order's wealth and power became increasingly conspicuous, the seeds of its downfall were planted in the realms of envy and debt. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, ruled a monarchy hungry for revenue and sensitive to creditors who could support or threaten the crown's agenda. His conflicts with the papacy over taxation and his need to find money quickly made the Templars an attractive target. They were wealthy, organizationally central, and papally protected in ways he resented. The dramatic arrests of October 1307 read like a page from a political thriller. In a single sweep, agents of the French crown seized Templars across the kingdom, accusing them of heresy, sodomy, idolatry, and sacrilegious rites. The charges were shocking, and they were deployed with a precision designed to discredit and destroy the Order's social and ecclesiastical legitimacy. Under torture, some confessed to heinous acts, others recanted or refused. The legal and moral confusion that followed was a theater in which accusation and confession, power and fear, played out with devastating effect. Pope Clement V, dragged into the conflict between spiritual authority and royal pressure, found himself in a difficult position. He issued the papal bull that ordered the arrest of Templars in 1307 and called for inquiries, but his capacity to resist Philip's political maneuvering was limited. The ensuing trials were clouded by forced confessions, suppression of documents, and an atmosphere where judicial independence buckled under royal influence. The Order's privileges were revoked, its property seized or redistributed, often to the Hospitallers, and the Grand Master Jacques de Molay was dragged toward a tragic end. Jacques de Molay's imprisonment, trial, and execution in 1314 became a poignant, nearly cinematic closing to the Order's visible medieval life. He proclaimed his innocence to the end, and his death by burning on an island in the Seine was followed in legend by a curse attributed to him, a rhetoric that would fuel later myths about the fall of the Templars. Historically, his execution reflected a collision between royal ambition, papal acquiescence, and public scandal, but it also provided a dramatic symbol for later writers who would romanticize or demonize the Order. The suppression of the Order did not erase its influence, and the dispersal of its assets fed new institutions and new narratives. Many properties in Europe were transferred to the Hospitallers or secularized into royal domains, records were scattered or destroyed, and surviving brethren sought refuge in other orders or in quieter lives. Yet the idea of the Templar, the image of a warrior monk who combined holiness with martial prowess, persisted in minds and memories. Out of historical fact rose myths that would survive into modern times. The idea that the Templars possessed a great hidden treasure, or had discovered the Holy Grail, or that they stewarded ancient and dangerous knowledge, belongs more to legend than to evidence. But those legends have power because they express anxieties about secret wealth, about the mingling of spiritual authority and temporal power, and about the vulnerabilities of institutions that become too rich, too autonomous, or too feared. From the Renaissance onward, writers recast the Order in varying colors. Enlightenment critics saw superstition and fanaticism, romantic authors embraced mystery and heroism. Modern conspiracy theorists reworked the narrative into stories of secret societies and occult rites. The Templars became a mirror in which cultural anxieties were reflected and multiplied, shifting with each age's concerns about religion, power, and secrecy. This long shadow has made the Templars a recurring presence in fiction, film, and political imagination. Scholars in modern times have sifted through surviving archives, charters, and archaeological evidence to distinguish fact from fiction. The picture that emerges is complex, not simply heroic or villainous. Meticulous land records reveal how their estates worked, charters show patronage networks, contemporary chronicles, read critically, provide glimpses of battles and negotiations. Archaeology at commandery sites reveals chapels, barns, and dovecots that speak to their daily routines more than to mysterious rites. Modern archaeology has also illuminated their military architecture, showing how they built to endure sieges and to control territory. Excavations at sites once thought lost have uncovered foundations of chapels, refectory floors, and stables that tell of a life organized around feeding men, maintaining horses, and sustaining prayer. The surviving structures of Temple Church in London or the remnants of their fortresses on Cyprus and in the East preserve a material continuity that links us to the men who watched horizons for ships and took communion before battle. The Templars' emblematic white mantle and red cross became recognizable across Christendom and later entered heraldic traditions, but the seal with two knights on one horse deserves a thought of its own. Rather than proof of poverty, which legend likes to tell, the seal likely symbolized brotherly solidarity and a vow to share hardship. Symbols like these functioned in medieval society as shorthand for identity and mission. They conveyed messages to allies and enemies, donors and lay people, in a world where literacy was limited and image carried meaning. The idea of the Templars as precursors to modern banks has a kernel of truth, but it should not be stretched into anachronism. Their financial practices, secure deposits, letters of credit, and the management of estates were innovative for their time and solved practical problems of travel and warfare. Yet they did not operate as banks in the modern sense with deposit insurance, complex credit markets, or fiduciary regulation. They were a hybrid institution that mixed spiritual aims with pragmatic stewardship of resources, a fusion that both enabled and endangered them. In considering the Templars' naval activities, it is useful to picture the logistical ballet required to move men and stone across seas and shores. Ships loaded with grain, iron, and timber escorted cavalry transports and overflowed with recruits bound for the east. Control of islands and ports allowed the order to stage campaigns and to sustain garrisons, and the loss of maritime supply lines could be as fatal as defeat in battle. Admiral captains, shipwrights, and sailors formed a lesser-known but critical part of the Templar world, their tasks as vital as those of knights on horseback. The recruitment of younger sons of nobility into the order was both a social strategy and a spiritual vocation. For a younger son without inheritance, joining the Templars offered honor, adventure, and a structured life of service. Families endowed the order with lands and money in exchange for spiritual benefits and the hope of securing dynastic memory. Obits and masses for donors were common instruments of spiritual economy. This relationship between families and the order reinforced local ties and integrated the Templars into the social web of medieval aristocracy. Some Templars were renowned individually for leadership or audacity, while many others remain anonymous in the record, their lives recorded only as names on charters or as footnotes in chronicles. The order attracted charismatic leaders, grand masters whose decisions could alter the fate of campaigns, and steady administrators whose daily records kept the sprawling machine functioning. Those layers of leadership and labor remind us that any broad institution depends on the steadiness of countless unknown hands as much as on the brilliance of a few. The experience of imprisonment, torture, and trial in the order's final years was a grim inversion of their usual role as captors and garrisoners. Captured brethren faced interrogations designed to destroy the order's spiritual authority. They were coerced into confessing blasphemies that sounded designed more to scandalize the public than to reflect genuine theological debate. Under duress, some admissions became the legal basis for condemnation, but the widespread use of torture and the political stakes complicate any assessment of guilt. After the suppression, the legal aftermath unfolded slowly and unevenly across Europe, reflecting the competing claims of monarchs, the papacy, and local elites. Some monarchs seized Templar wealth outright for their treasuries. In other cases, properties were transferred to hospitallers or to secular lords. The redistribution of assets changed local economies and sometimes sparked disputes that lasted generations, because land was a living resource, producing rents and obligations that could not be liquidated easily. In the centuries after their demise, the Templars continued to capture imagination and provoke debate among historians, antiquarians, and novelists alike. Romantic historians praised their ideals and created heroic narratives. Skeptical chroniclers criticized their supposed hypocrisy. Occultists and conspiracy theorists wove them into labyrinthine tales of hidden knowledge. The mixture of historical record and imaginative elaboration created a palimpsest in which truth and fiction overlapped, each generation rewriting the order to suit its anxieties and yearnings. The Templars' impact on the landscape of Europe is visible not only in ruins and churches but in place names, local customs, and surviving legal records. In many towns, the name temple or the presence of a former commandery marks a continuum from medieval property to modern landscape. These traces remind us that history is not only a sequence of famous battles and dramatic trials, it is also the quiet sedimentation of everyday routines, rents collected, harvests stored, masses said for the souls of donors. The question of what the Templars stood for is ultimately a moral and historical puzzle. They claimed spiritual aims, defended pilgrims, and fought with courage, but they also gathered wealth, engaged in politics, and were not immune to the temptations and compromises of power. Their complexity resists simple moralizing. They can be read as both defenders of an ideal and as actors who participated in systems of domination. Understanding them requires holding these contradictions together rather than forcing them into a single portrait. In museums and archives, objects and documents that survived the centuries provide tangible bridges to that complex past. A charter signed by a Grand Master, a ledger recording rents from a vineyard, a rusted spur, a prayer book with a Templar inscription, these are the fragments that historians use to reconstruct a way of life. Each artifact invites questions about agency, motive, and context. Piecing them together is an exercise in humility and imagination, where every scrap helps form a less mythologized picture. The orders that outlasted the Templars often inherited not just lands but responsibilities and personnel, and the Hospitallers in particular absorbed many of their properties and sometimes former brothers. This transfer of assets reshaped the military order's map in the 14th century, concentrating resources in different hands and allowing some institutions to continue the combined mission of defense and care. Yet the Templars' absence left a gap in symbolic and political terms, an emptiness that inspired speculation about what had disappeared and why. Across centuries, popular fascination turned the Templars into a repository for fantasies about secret knowledge, treasure, and continuity with ancient mysteries. These stories often reflect more about the era that told them than about the medieval knights themselves, anxieties about institutional secrecy, romantic yearnings for noble brotherhoods, and suspicions about the accumulation of power. The persistence of such tales shows how historical episodes can be retooled into mythology, shaping cultural memory long after documents have faded. The Templars' administrative competence, their record-keeping, and their correspondence illustrate how medieval organizations managed complexity long before modern bureaucratic models. Their roles and registers reveal attention to accounting and property law, and their correspondence with patrons and popes shows diplomatic nuance. This administrative side of the order reminds us that medieval institutions were often sophisticated networks of communication and management, not merely feudal anachronisms. In looking at their military engagements across the Mediterranean and the Levant, we see adaptability alongside stubbornness. They could change tactics when needed, adopting new siege engines or reorganizing garrisons, but they could also rationalize holding untenable positions out of loyalty to a vow or because of prestige and strategic misjudgment. The combination of adaptability and doctrinal commitment made them formidable yet sometimes inflexible, a duality that mattered when political winds shifted. When we imagine Templar knights at prayer, in law courts, on ships, or in the thick of battle, we see not archetypes but real people with mundane concerns, letters from home, disputes over inheritances, the grief of losing comrades, and the boredom of routine. Their diaries rarely survive, but their legal pleas and polite complaints to superiors remind us that they were as human as any group of men bound together by duty. That humanists should temper narratives that idealize or demonize them, for history is less tidy than myth would prefer. The Templars' presence in the Holy Land also shaped interreligious exchange in unexpected ways. Military necessity often required truce agreements, trade in goods, and sometimes the recruitment of local auxiliaries. These interactions forced a practical engagement with peoples of different faiths. The boundaries between religious hostility and everyday commerce were porous, and the Templars navigated them with a mix of rigor and expediency. Such contact complicates any simplistic story of conquest and resistance and suggests a layered reality where conflict and coexistence coexisted uneasily. In many ways, the story of the Templars is a study in the double-edged nature of institutional strength. Their discipline, centralization, and access to resources made them powerful and effective, but those very qualities also centralized risk. When a king decided to move against them or public sentiment turned sour, the entire structure could be bent to powerful will. It is a reminder that institutions that succeed spectacularly in one age can become suddenly vulnerable when political priorities change. The trials and legal proceedings that ended the order's legal life are also a story of medieval jurisprudence under strain. The use of torture, the manipulation of witnesses, and the political pressure that surrounded the process revealed the fragility of legal protections when confronted with royal power. Those episodes forced the Church to reflect on judicial practices and eventually contributed to debates about torture and due process that would be part of the long evolution of European legal culture. The Templars' symbolic powers survived even when their physical presence diminished. The red cross on white, a visual shorthand for a holy warrior, continued to inspire imaginations in later crusading revivals and in the Romantic literature of the 19th century. Their image provided a narrative resource for writers who wanted both the moral clarity of a sacred cause and the excitement of martial exploits. This symbolic afterlife transformed historical actors into cultural icons whose meanings could shift according to taste and ideology. For modern historians and listeners alike, the Templars pose a question about how we remember institutions that are both sacred and political. Do we judge them by their spiritual vows, by their military deeds, by their administrative competence, or by the injustices that sometimes accompanied their power? The answer, inevitably, is all of the above. They are part of a human tapestry where motives and outcomes mingle, where courage and cruelty can be neighbors, and where faith informs but does not fully determine action. The physical remains of the order, ruined chapels, fortified walls, fragments of sculpture, ask us to imagine daily rituals repeated for years, bells summoning brothers to prayer, the clinking of chain mail in the armory, the steady scolding of marshals in the yard. These sensory images reanimate a world distant in time but close in human terms, a world where devotion and duty met in chapels that smelled of incense and in fields where horses pawed impatiently. In such scenes, the Templars become palpable as temporal beings rather than merely symbols on a page. When historians consult charters, they find networks of patronage and influence that show how embedded the order was in medieval society. Donations of land were often accompanied by obligations, masses to be said, obits to be observed, and sometimes burial rites for donors and their families. These spiritual economies created reciprocal ties that tied the Templars to local communities, ensuring that their survival depended on social goodwill as much as on military prowess. The order's fall reshaped the medieval political landscape in ways that rippled beyond immediate property transfers. Kings who seized Templar assets used the sudden influx of wealth to fund wars or to consolidate power, shifting the balance between crown and nobles in some regions. Papal authority, already compromised by conflict with monarchs, was further weakened by the appearance of papal complicity in Templar suppression, stirring debates about the nature and limits of papal power. Even in death, the Templars inspired legal and legendary continuities, lawsuits over land, stories of hidden caches, and the curious persistence of Templar place names. Legal records show that disputes over former Templar properties continued into later centuries because land rights have a way of outlasting regimes and public scandals. The persistence of such claims keeps the Templars present in mundane legal proceedings as much as in dramatic myths. The story of the Knights Templar illuminates the medieval world in microcosm: theology and warfare, finance and piety, heroism and greed, local obligations and international ambitions. They operated at the convergence of multiple worlds and thus become a useful lens through which to understand the broader patterns of medieval Europe and the Mediterranean. To study them is to study the tensions and energies that shaped a pivotal era of Western history. For listeners in the present, the Templars offer a narrative that is both exotic and instructive. They are exotic in their martial monastic combination and instructive in the lessons their rise and fall teach about power, accountability, and the dangers of concentrated authority. Their story warns of the vulnerabilities that accompany wealth and the political perils that can follow when religious devotion intersects with temporal ambition. It also inspires consideration of vocation. Why would men leave comfortable lives to live under strict vows in a dangerous, unstable world? There is a deep human fascination in the idea of those who trade comfort for a cause, and the Templars epitomize that paradox: men who renounced family and property in the name of spiritual duty, who risked death for a mission they believed was holy. That vow produced extraordinary acts of courage and endurance, acts remembered in chronicles and in the names of places that still bear their mark. The moral gravity of such commitment continues to resonate because it confronts us with questions about sacrifice, identity, and the costs of devotion. The Templars' material culture also tells a story about medieval craftsmanship and patronage. Their armories commissioned plating, leatherwork, and horse trappings from skilled artisans who were part of a broader economic web. The techniques of forging mail, shaping helmets, and treating leather were labor-intensive and reflected regional varieties of technology and taste. These objects were not merely utilitarian, they were also invested with symbolic meaning, for armor represented status and fidelity as much as protection. Throughout the order's history, communication proved essential. Letters were the lifeblood of command, summoning reinforcements, requesting funds, or negotiating with kings and popes. Scribes in Templar houses produced documents that synchronized distant branches, allowing a commandery in England to contribute to defense efforts in Acre. The effort required to maintain such a network speaks to a high degree of organizational sophistication and an appreciation for the value of information. Templar chapels and liturgy reflected an aesthetic of modest splendor, where the order's spiritual life found expression in hymns, altars, and ritual. The religious calendar structured the year, with feast days and processions offering moments of communal identity. At those times, the Red Cross might be displayed proudly, reminding brethren and the public of the order's sacral purpose even as it performed secular services like defense and estate management. The Templars' relationship to money and finance remains one of the most compelling aspects of their historical footprint. Their financial practices were pragmatic and varied, from simple rent collection to complex arrangements with monarchs who promised repayment from fiscal sources. Their role as creditors placed them in an ambiguous moral position. They aided kings and nobles, yet their loans could be used to exert pressure or to create obligations that bent political outcomes in ways that made some enemies. When the first stones of Templar castles were cut and set, they were doing more than building fortifications. They were staking claims in a contested cultural space. Castles were statements of intent. We will hold this land. We will control this road. We will protect these people. The architecture of these fortresses, with thick walls, guarded gates, and towers for overwatch, reflected a worldview in which territory and security mattered above other considerations. Architecture, in that sense, was the order's policy made stone. Templar medicine and care, though primitive by modern standards, showed a humane orientation toward wounded brethren and pilgrims. Their infirmaries treated lacerations, managed putrid wounds with herbal remedies, and provided rest for exhausted travelers. While their medical knowledge was limited, their willingness to care for others reflected the order's monastic roots and differentiated them from purely mercenary bodies. Language and literacy within the order were tools of governance and cohesion. Latin, as the lingua franca of ecclesiastical and legal discourse, bound the order's documents together across regions, while local vernaculars enabled everyday communication. The Templars' record keepers used formulas and notations that allowed for quick reference across a variety of legal contexts, and that bureaucratic skill underpinned their ability to oversee disparate properties. The psychology of Templar life also deserves attention. Living under strict rules produced a community that celebrated obedience and feared dissent. Vows were enforced by ceremonies and supervised by officials. Transgressions could mean penance or expulsion. Yet this system created loyalty as well as conformity, loyalty to a boss, to a rule, and to an identity that crossed national lines. That psychological cohesiveness made the order formidable. It also made them vulnerable when political currents turned. The balance between secrecy and publicity in the Templars' operations was tricky. They needed confidentiality for diplomatic and financial matters, but they also broadcast their identity through seals, mantles, and public ceremonies. This mix of secrecy and spectacle created space for suspicion, especially when royal propagandists sought to portray them as a cabal. The tensions around visibility and opacity contributed significantly to the narratives that led to their suppression. The Templar story is also a human drama of families and lineages, for many noble houses invested members in the order with hopes of spiritual merit and political alliance. Indentures, endowments, and burial rites linked the order to dynastic concerns. The Templars, in effect, became custodians of memory for many families. These human connections made the order part of the fabric of medieval kinship networks, not an isolated monastic enclave. From a modern vantage point, the Knights Templar are sometimes invoked as symbols in political and cultural debates, cast alternately as paragons of virtue or as examples of dangerous theocratic militancy. These reinterpretations often say more about present anxieties than about medieval realities, yet they underscore how a medieval institution can be repurposed for modern meaning. The Templars' continuing relevance in public discourse highlights the enduring power of their image and the malleability of historical symbols. Ultimately, the story of the Templars is both a narrative of dramatic events and a tapestry of ordinary moments stitched together across centuries: the clink of chain mail in a courtyard at dawn, the scratch of a quill as a scribe records a gift, the whisper of confession in a small chapel, the terror of a city under siege, and the silent despair of a man led to execution. These images animate the past and remind listeners that history is made of human choices, fears, and hopes. Their legacy challenges us to think about the responsibilities that accompany institutions capable of wielding spiritual authority and temporal power. Are there mechanisms that can prevent abuses when religious zeal and financial resources converge? How might transparency, oversight, or humility have altered their path? Such questions are not only medieval, they reverberate in any era where power gathers around institutions that claim moral purpose. Even as centuries passed, traces of the Templars influenced architecture, legal practices, and social networks, shaping medieval Europe in subtle but durable ways. Their commanderies continued to be centers of local administration, even when their proprietors changed, and their castles served new lords who inherited both infrastructure and strategic advantages. In these continuities, we see how institutions imprint landscapes and institutions long after their names have faded from power. The Templars also remind us that religious motivation does not preclude worldly engagement, nor does worldly success prove spiritual corruption. Through their contradictions, they offer a complex picture of medieval life and an invitation to nuance. To love them or to loathe them is to miss the fuller, messier truth. They were a human phenomenon of their time, shaped by belief, ambition, and the exigencies of a contested world. Studying the Templars requires a disciplinary openness that crosses military history, ecclesiastical studies, economic history, and archaeology, because their story touches so many aspects of medieval life. The diversity of sources needed to reconstruct their world, archives, ruins, chronicles, liturgical books, demands patience and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. For many questions remain contested and newly discovered evidence can reshape interpretations. The Templar name endures in roads, churches, and institutions that preserve echoes of the medieval order, a living reminder that history leaves durable marks in surprising places. Walking through an old European town, one can still find the stone outlines of a commandery, a chapel's nave, or a relic redisplayed in a museum. And these places invite reflection on a past where prayer and war sat side by side. Those quiet marks of continuity form an intimate bridge between our present and a past rich in conflict and devotion. To listen to their story is to be invited into a long conversation about courage, faith, and the consequences of power. The Templars' combination of piety and martial skill captured imaginations in their own day and continues to do so now, because their paradoxes mirror our own: competing commitments, the allure of purpose, and the danger of accumulated strength. Their history is an invitation to ask how institutions can live by high ideals without becoming instruments of harm. In the end, the Knights Templar are neither saints nor monsters, but complex actors whose lives illuminate a turbulent age. Their rise and fall trace the arc of medieval Christendom's outward ambitions and inward anxieties, a story that is as much about human frailty as about organizational ingenuity. For listeners who want to understand the medieval world, the Templars provide an unfailing source of insight into how aspiration and fear can intertwine to shape destinies. This long history leaves us with a final thought: the past resists simplification, and the Templars' tale is a reminder that human institutions are fragile, contingent, and deeply human. Their mantles have long since been folded away, their banners lowered, and their men buried, but the questions their story raises about power, faith, obligation, and memory remain urgent and alive. To study them is not to resurrect an order, but to learn from a mirror held up across the centuries, reflecting our own struggles with devotion and authority. The story of the Knights Templar has a beginning in the hush between swords and prayers, when crusaders needed shelter and safety, and a handful of pious men answered with vows to protect pilgrims. There were fighters who prayed and bankers who guarded treasure, and in the fragile geometry of the 12th century their reputation grew until it became a kind of power. They carved out a presence across the Holy Land and Europe, building fortresses and houses, and with each new success they accumulated wealth, land, and influence. Power attracts scrutiny, and the very virtues that built their order also planted the seeds of suspicion and envy that would later bloom into accusation and ruin. By the end of the 13th century, the world had changed around the Templars. The crusading fervor that had fed their mission had dwindled into intermittent expeditions and uneasy truces, while the financial instruments they created, letters of credit, secured deposits, and a network of commanderies, made them central to European politics and economy. Kings found it convenient to borrow from a disciplined and international body that answered to papal authority rather than local barons. This convenience, however, often turned into dependence and resentment, and debts accrued in the royal halls of Paris would become the sharpest edge of the sword that felled the order. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, ruled a kingdom where money and royal prestige were inseparable. He inherited a crown that needed constant repair and an imperial posture that required expensive wars and elaborate courts. Philip was not above using every instrument of power to secure the royal treasury, and he looked upon the Templars not as fellow servants of Christendom but as a repository of resources that could be appropriated with the right pretext. His grievances against the papacy and his domestic needs would conspire in the coming decade to create a drama whose violence would outstrip any battlefield the knights had faced. Tension between Philip and the papacy had been simmering for years. Boniface VIII, a pope of fierce independence, had clashed openly with Philip, and their bitter exchanges undermined papal authority in the eyes of many secular rulers. When Clement V, a more pliant pope from Gascony, ascended the papal throne, the French king saw an opportunity. Clement's proximity to French influence and his earlier career in the orbit of French politics put the papacy in an awkward and vulnerable position, and the fate of the Templars would unfold within that vulnerable space. October 13th, 1307 is the date most people remember, a day that began as a routine morning and ended as the moment the order's world split open. On that morning, under orders from Philip, royal agents moved through France and arrested hundreds of Templars at once. The sweep was drama and logistics entwined, coordinated, merciless, and theatrical. In many towns, the knights did not resist, bewildered by the suddenness of accusation and unsure how to counter a king who wielded his power with such certainty. The charges Philip and his advisors leveled against the Templars were lurid and precise, chosen to inflame both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. They accused the brothers of heresy, of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross, of idolatry, and of obscene sexual practices. Such allegations were not merely legal, they were moral detonations that shattered public trust. These were crimes that the Church was obligated to pursue, which suited Philip well because it forced the papacy to act while he controlled the initial evidence and the tempo of the prosecutions. From the moment of arrest, the machinery of interrogation and confession turned in different directions in different places. In France, the royal courts took the lead and collaborated with inquisitors who specialized in rooting out heresy. Torture, as practiced in medieval France, was a blunt instrument but a legally sanctioned one in certain contexts, and many Templars found themselves subject to it. Under the weight of pain and the promise of mercy, confessions began to appear, often containing the very stories Philip had spread before the arrests, which only lent them grim legitimacy. But confessions obtained under duress are small, pliant things. Some knights confessed to the full catalog of alleged crimes, describing ritual blasphemies and obscene initiations in gruesome detail. Others admitted to lesser failings or to nothing at all, and many retracted their statements once removed from the instruments of torture. The pattern of confession and retraction would become a central theme of the trials: public admissions that satisfied a crown and private recantations that suggested coercion. For historians and for the papacy, these contradictions were a mirror that showed how fragile legal truth can be when power dictates the terms of proof. The papal response was complicated and cautious, reflective of Clement V's delicate position between royal pressure and ecclesiastical duty. Rather than immediately condemn, the Pope issued orders that sought to centralize control of the investigation and to keep the ultimate judgment in Rome. He summoned depositions, demanded lists of accusations, and attempted to supervise the process so that the crown could not claim total moral ownership of the purge. The papacy's ambivalence, however, would be interpreted in many different ways and would itself become a bargaining chip in the politics that followed. Across Europe, the response to Philip's accusations was uneven. Some monarchs complied quickly with papal commands to arrest or investigate local Templars, while others hesitated or protected members of the order. The English crown, for example, moved cautiously, never closing the loop entirely on Philip's urgency. In Iberia and Portugal, various arrangements were made to preserve Templar property or to reconstitute their holdings under new names. The diversity of reactions underscored a key reality: the Templars were not a monolith, they were woven into the fabric of many realms, and those realms would decide their fates with a mixture of fear, self-interest, and local custom. Within the prisons, the Knights confronted a collapse of the order's social world. Commanders who had once moved through halls of power now existed in narrow cells, stripped of swords, sometimes of daily comfort, often of hope. A few men were elderly, others were young and frightened, and all of them had to reconcile the identity they had forged under vow with the accusations now set before them. Some chose to defend the honor of their order with stubborn silence, others sought to save their lives by reciting narratives that matched the interrogators' expectations. These human choices, made in the darkest hours, were to determine both the legal record and the moral memory of the order. Guillaume de Nogaret was the king's instrument and his public face, a lawyer and royal counselor who navigated the seams between law and politics with ruthless competence. He gathered evidence, encouraged confessions, and orchestrated the public performance of royal justice. His motives were both practical and political. Deliverance of the Templars' wealth to the crown would relieve royal debts, while a successful prosecution would enhance royal prestige. Nogaret understood that the spectacle of guilt would be as important as any verdict, and he made sure that the spectacle found its stage. The methods used to extract confessions varied in intensity and implicated not just royal agents but church officials who feared heresy as both a spiritual and social contagion. Inquisitors applied theological frameworks to the accusations, probing for doctrinal deviations and apostasy. Their questions often focused on initiation rites and the content of the knight's oaths, and it was in these interviews that stories of secret rituals emerged. Whether these stories represented reality, rumor, misunderstanding between cultures, or the inventiveness of interrogators, the answers given in the shadow of potential eternal damnation carried enormous weight. Among the most notorious charges were claims that Templars had worshipped a mysterious idol, sometimes described as a cat-headed figure or a bearded man with horns. Such images inflamed the medieval imagination because they suggested idolatry, the vilest of spiritual betrayals. Modern scholars debate whether any such object existed, or if it was a grotesque invention born of testimony keyed to pain and fear. Regardless, the image of the idol took on a life of its own, becoming a symbol that both secular prosecutors and later mythmakers would use to depict the order's alleged depravity. Initiation rites were another central element of the accusations, and here the record becomes a tangled web of truth and invention. Some Templars spoke of simple, even somber, rituals of vow and obedience. Others recounted actions that sounded like the exact opposite of Christian devotion. The contradictions suggest that local practices varied and that the narratives were shaped by the expectations and preconceptions of interrogators. The medieval court asked for a single story and would treat contradictions as evidence of guilt, but the social realities of an international brotherhood resist so tidy an interpretation. The intellectual climate of the period also helped frame how accusations gained traction. In a world where heresy and schism toppled kingdoms, the suggestion that a powerful, international order had strayed from orthodoxy was terrifying. If the Knights answered to an allegiance that superseded local authorities, then they were a political threat as well as a spiritual one. The narrative of corruption was therefore useful to a king who wished to centralize authority, and it found a sympathetic ear among those who saw the consolidation of royal power as a necessity for the stability of their realms. Philip's financial entanglements with the Templars were no mere rumor. The crown had borrowed extensively, and the order's fiscal network provided a kind of liquidity that ordinary treasuries could not. There were outstanding loans and complex agreements that the king could not easily cancel without heavy political and legal fallout. By bringing public charges, the monarchy created the legal optics necessary to seize assets while still claiming the moral high ground. The process was not simply theft, it was a state-engineered legal expropriation dressed in the vestments of righteousness. Even within the hierarchy of the church, there were men who doubted the thoroughness and fairness of the French prosecutions. Bishops and theologians outside France questioned how much of the evidence was manufactured by royal officials and how much was the result of genuine ecclesiastical investigation. The papacy, for its part, attempted to maintain a procedural distance while consolidating authority over any adjudication. Clement V feared the precedent of a sovereign king unilaterally dissolving an international religious order without papal sanction, and he moved gradually as a result. The trials never unfolded as a single unified legal event. Instead, they were a series of processes that varied by region, temperament of judges, and the degree of royal pressure. In some courts, especially in France, the pace was swift and brutal. In other places, the knights were afforded hearings that lasted for years, during which they and their defenders presented theological defenses and affidavits from lay and clerical supporters. This unevenness reinforced the notion that the ultimate fate of the Templars was not simply a matter of truth, but of geography and politics. As the legal saga dragged on, the public spectacle became a kind of theater of power. Auto da fe and public executions were designed not just to punish but to teach. On the scaffold, the last, dramatized moments of the order were compressed into images that would endure: men in religious habit confessing heresy, then recanting, then dying with the ambiguous aura of both sinner and saint. The images were powerful because they enacted a complete narrative: accusation, confession, sentence, and death. For those watching, the ritualized end of the Knights was meant to be both a closing of a scandal and a reaffirmation of sovereign authority. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, occupied a space both tragic and emblematic. He had served the order in a time of decline and reassessment, and when he stood before his accusers, he represented the institutional face of the Templars. De Molay's initial confessions were complex, influenced by the pressures around him, and later retracted, a move that only complicated his public image. His ultimate execution in 1314, burned at the stake along with other leaders, has become a focal event for both historians and storytellers, a final flourish that bespoke both political triumph and cruelty. The interweaving of confession and retraction was especially poignant in de Molay's story. In one sequence, he confessed under pressure, then recanted when circumstances allowed, and then faced a public death that would be remembered in rumor as much as in record. Some witnesses later recounted his dying cry that both the Pope and the King would soon answer to God for the injustice. Whether the utterance was apocryphal or factual, it became part of the mythic overlay that immediately settled over the order's demise and that would later feed legends of curses and divine retribution. The papal decision was, in the end, a legal and political act that attempted to reconcile many conflicting demands. At the Council of Vienne, which met from 1311 to 1312, delegates from across Christendom debated the evidence and the fate of the order in a prolonged series of discussions. Clement, under pressure from the French crown and mindful of the fragile unity of the Church, ultimately issued Vox in Excelso in 1312, a bull that formally dissolved the order. His language avoided a blanket declaration of universal guilt, grounding the decision instead in the necessity of preserving the unity and peace of the Church. Dissolution did not mean the same thing everywhere. The property of the Templars was supposed to pass to the Hospitallers, another military order, but in practice the transfer was messy and contested. Kings and nobles seized lands, revenues were redirected, and in Portugal the situation took a unique turn. There the order was effectively reconstituted as the Order of Christ, preserving both personnel and property under a different name and maintaining a thread of continuity that would later influence Portuguese expansion. In other realms, the Hospitallers did absorb significant holdings, but the process was piecemeal and fraught with dispute. Beyond legal and political maneuvers lay the day-to-day reality of ruined lives. Hundreds of brothers had been imprisoned, interrogated, and stripped of their stations. Many died in confinement, others lingered in obscurity, their vows broken by force or by despair. Some found refuge in other orders or integrated into secular life, but for most the world they had known was forever altered. The proud bureaucracy of commanderies, castles, and farms that had once hummed with purpose fell silent, or else was repurposed by new masters who had little interest in the spiritual ideals that had birthed the brothers. In the years after the suppression, the memory of the Templars became a malleable thing, shaped by rumor, by political needs, and by the appetite of storytellers. Pamphlets and ballads turned their fall into a saga of crime and retribution, while apologists painted them as martyrs wronged by a corrupt king. The order's financial practices, which had been sophisticated for their time, were simplified in popular memory into greed and cunning. The texture of daily life for a medieval knight was smoothed into legends of treasure and secret rites that made for far better story than the mundane truth of bookkeeping and castle maintenance. The question of where the Templar treasure went has fueled speculation for centuries. Some treasure certainly came into royal hands in France, some was seized by secular lords in the confusion, some was transferred to the Hospitallers. Tales of hidden caches and secret hoards swallowed the public imagination and were reinforced by the opacity of medieval record-keeping. But historians caution that the idea of a single, massive, undisclosed treasure is more the product of legend than of careful accounting, which shows a complex dispersal of assets across many hands and institutions. The legal documents produced during the trials form a contradictory archive. Transcripts of interrogations, depositions, and royal edicts reveal both procedural rigor and procedural abuse. The records show local inquisitors trying to adhere to canonical forms of questioning even while royal justices applied secular methods best suited to extracting confessions. This mix of legal cultures produced outcomes that were at once juridical and theatrical, reflecting a medieval world in which law, faith, and power could not be neatly separated. The Chinon parchment, discovered in the Vatican archives in the early 21st century, reopened some debates about papal involvement and the degree to which Clement may have absolved some Templar leaders. The document suggests that in 1308 papal agents had interviewed top knights and granted absolutions to some under specific conditions. The parchment complicates the narrative of a papacy complicit in wholesale destruction, showing instead a more ambiguous relationship, a pope trying to exercise his prerogative, constrained by political realities and the limits of control over sovereign courts. Medieval legal theory also matters to the story because it shaped how evidence was valued and how guilt was established. Canon law allowed for inquiry into doctrinal deviations and for the use of certain coercive measures in extremis, while secular law in France was more direct in its acceptance of torture for obtaining confessions. The intersection of these legal traditions meant that the Templars were tried in overlapping jurisdictions with different standards, and this legal plurality ensured that their fate would be determined by a mosaic of procedures rather than a single, uniform trial. Beyond the courts, the cultural consequences of the trials were profound. The disappearance of the Templars altered patterns of patronage, redistribution of land, and the social role of knightly orders in Europe. The institutional vacuum allowed rulers to consolidate fiscal control and to reconfigure the relationship between military service, landed wealth, and royal authority. The suppression thus marks not only a moral and judicial rupture but a structural shift in medieval governance and the financing of war. The Templars' downfall also stimulated theological reflection on institutional sin and reform. Clerics and theologians used the episode to argue about the vulnerability of religious orders to corruption, the proper oversight by the papacy, and the balance between episcopal authority and monastic autonomy. The debate resonated in monasteries and cathedrals where the memory of the Templars served as both warning and case study for how quickly spiritual nobility could be undermined by human weakness and political intrigue. In popular culture, the echoes of the trials have been louder and more persistent than the cold footnotes of legal documents. From romantic poets to modern novelists and filmmakers, storytellers have seized the Templars as symbols of mystery, betrayal, and lost treasure. The historical ambiguity of their end suits narrative reinvention. A powerful order felled by conspiracy is a tale that invites imagination. But the trade in myth has at times obscured the more complex reality of institutional failure, political expediency, and legal artifice that better explains what actually happened. The regional contours of repression are also significant. In Scotland and parts of Germany, the Templars fared differently than in France, often protected or simply neglected by local authorities. In Aragon and Castile, the process of suppression was influenced by reconquest politics and by the entwined interests of kings and lords who had long-standing relationships with Templar houses. These local variances serve as a reminder that medieval Europe was not a single political or social organism but a patchwork of jurisdictions in which royal policy could be implemented only through negotiation and compromise. Trials of individual Templars illuminate human dramas often lost in macro-historical narratives. There are testimonies of brothers who protested their innocence with the stubbornness of men defending a lifetime of vows, and there are records of others who capitulated in the faint hope of reprieve. Some confessed to minor faults born of human frailty rather than conspiratorial wickedness, revealing how the contours of confession were stretched by both conscience and coercion. These personal stories complicate any wholesale moral judgment and instead present a range of human responses to extraordinary pressure. The role of clergy in the process was double-edged. Some priests stood as accusers and examiners, deploying theological expertise to examine the knight's beliefs. Others acted as advocates, pleading for more measured inquiry and humane treatment. This ambivalence reflected broader tensions within the Church about how to handle charges against an influential order. The duty to root out error versus the need to avoid giving secular rulers carte blanche to destroy religious institutions for material gain. The clergy's split stance contributed to the drawn-out, contradictory nature of the proceedings. As the years passed, the Templars' legal legacy was used to justify institutional reforms in the Church and to temper the ambitions of military orders. The council decrees and the way property was redistributed offered templates for how religious and military institutions might be regulated to prevent future abuses. Yet reforms were never fully realized in a way that prevented state appropriation of church assets in later centuries, showing that the lessons drawn from the Templars' fall were partial and often subordinated to the needs of powerful rulers. The historiography of the trials has evolved as scholars gained access to more archives and as methodological approaches changed. For centuries, the dominant narratives were shaped by polemics, national agendas, or romantic hyperbole. Modern scholarship seeks to parse confession from coercion, to trace financial records, and to situate the events within the broader European context of state building. This slow but steady sifting of sources has revealed more nuance and fewer dramatic certainties, though it has not extinguished the appetite for scandalous simplicity in the public imagination. Memory and myth have also kept the Templars alive in ways that official records never could. Secret treasure, lost rituals, and whispered curses make a better story than account ledgers and legal jargon, and those stories have been retold in novels, films, and conspiracy theories. The persistence of Templar mythology reveals something about how societies process trauma and loss. By transforming complexity into legend, people craft narratives that satisfy emotional needs even as they sacrifice accuracy. The Templars thus live on in culture as much as in archives. Even as the Church dissolved the order, it did not, at least in official pronouncement, brand every member an irredeemable heretic. The papal bulls and later procedures allowed for individual rehabilitation in certain cases, granting absolutions or conditional reassignments for those who confessed and showed penance. This legal flexibility demonstrates the papacy's attempt to distinguish between institutional governance and the moral culpability of individual brothers, even if the broader public and royal authorities preferred a simpler narrative of guilt. The spatial legacy of the Templars is visible in stone across Europe and the Levant. Commanderies, keeps, and chapel ruins, the landscape, mute witnesses to a network that once connected distant lands. Some of these structures were repurposed, some neglected, and some preserved as curious relics of a vanished order. Walking through these sites today is to feel the slow sediment of history, the echoes of prayer, the slate of practical economics, and the abruptness of political violence that can dissolve institutions more quickly than walls can crumble. The legal aftermath also included long disputes over compensation and restitution. Families, local lords, and ecclesiastical institutions all claimed portions of the former Templar estate, and the courts would be occupied for years untangling title and ownership. The messiness of these proceedings illustrates how the seizure of property for political ends generates conflicts that endure across generations, begetting litigation, local rancor, and continued negotiation about what had been taken and by whom. Culturally, the fall of the Templars affected the perception of religious vows and the security of monastic life. The spectacle of an order suddenly rendered suspect made other religious men and women more aware of their vulnerability to accusation and royal interference. The episode hardened some defenders of monastic privilege and encouraged others to advocate for stronger papal protections, measures that would later shape the legal architecture of the medieval church in ways both protective and limiting. The psychological dimension of the trials is often overlooked but crucial. For knights whose identities were forged through ritual, camaraderie, and a singular purpose, the assault on their order was an assault on self. The cognitive dissonance of serving Christ while being called a heretic produced despair, anger, and in some cases, a stoic acceptance of martyrdom. These interior experiences, while rarely captured in legal documents, must be imagined to understand how individuals navigated the rupture between personal honor and public shame. Contrary to the image of absolute annihilation, some aspects of Templar expertise survived in other institutions. The financial innovations, administrative practices, and military organizational skills of the order did not vanish with the last flames at the stake. They diffused into other organizations and into the practices of states. Treasury procedures, command structures, and logistical acumen were absorbed, adapted, and sometimes improved upon, so that the Templars' practical legacy outlived their legal existence. The international dimension of the trials raises questions about medieval sovereignty and jurisdiction that echo into modern legal thought. Who had the right to try members of an international order that transcended national boundaries? Was the Pope the ultimate judge, or could a king claim primacy over crimes committed within his realm? The Templar case forced medieval institutions to confront these dilemmas and, in doing so, contributed to the evolving vocabulary of jurisdiction, sovereignty, and transcultural law. For the laity who had relied on the Templars for security and banking, the abrupt dissolution produced disorientation and practical hardship. Services they had come to expect, safe conducts, loans, custodial care for pilgrims, disappeared or were transformed under new management. The commercial networks that had been anchored by Templar houses needed to find new conduits, and for a time the marketplace felt the tremor of institutional removal. Merchants, pilgrims, and local communities felt the absence in ways that legal historians sometimes underestimate. The memory of injustice, whether perceived or real, became a resource for political movements and conspiratorial narratives in subsequent centuries. The sense that a powerful order had been wronged by a corrupt king resonated with later groups who saw themselves as victims of state overreach. This echo explains part of the Templars' afterlife as cultural artifacts used to challenge authority or to romanticize resistance. The past, once mobilized as grievance, becomes an instrument of present claims. As academic study deepened, the Templar trials became a laboratory for scholars of medieval law, politics, and society. Interdisciplinary research brought together paleography, fiscal history, and comparative legal studies to produce a more textured account. Papers and monographs debated the degree to which Philip's motives were purely fiscal or whether genuine concern about doctrinal corruption played a role. The result has been a historiography marked by nuanced skepticism rather than the earlier simple certainties of either total innocence or total guilt. The role of rumor and local accusation in a generation of charges cannot be overstated. In many towns, ordinary people had conversations about the Templars' secrecy and wealth, and such talk could crystallize into formal accusation once a royal impetus existed to harness it. Rumor thus functioned like dry tinder, needing only a spark in the form of royal focus to ignite into formal prosecution. Understanding this dynamic helps explain how the cascade of arrests could feel both systematic and capricious at once. The question of whether the Templars were uniformly immoral or uniformly martyr-like misses the point of human institutions, which are comprised of contradictory people acting in contingent circumstances. Some Templars doubtless behaved in ways inconsistent with their vows, some were corrupt, as human beings have always been. Others were devout, competent, and unjustly mistreated. The trials reveal not a moral binary but a spectrum of behaviors subjected to the blunt logic of political expediency. The spectacle of the trials also served as a rehearsal for later conflicts between states and supranational institutions. The dynamic of a powerful monarch prosecuting an international religious organization would reoccur in different guises in succeeding centuries, and the Templars' fate provides an early template for how nations might subordinate transnational loyalties to sovereign control. This historical continuity shows that the tension between local sovereignty and international affiliation is as old as complex political life itself. Even within the papacy, the episode contributed to introspection about the limits of papal power and the danger of being too close to secular interests. Clement's handling of the Templars has been criticized as weak and complicit, while others view it as a politically prudent effort to preserve institutional unity under difficult circumstances. In either case, the papacy's reputation for spiritual leadership was tested, and the episode left a legacy of caution about entanglement with powerful monarchs. As the 15th and 16th centuries unfolded, Templar legend fused with changing cultural anxieties about secrecy, heresy, and the control of knowledge. The idea of an order with hidden wisdom and lost books dovetailed with Renaissance curiosity and later with Enlightenment suspicion of religious institutions. Over time, the medieval Templars were transformed into symbols used by a wide range of ideological projects, some scholarly and some fantastical, showing how historical actors can be abstracted into cultural motifs. Legal reforms in the wake of the trials were modest rather than sweeping, but they did reinforce certain principles about the rights of accused and the procedures for ecclesiastical discipline. The use of torture remained a stain on medieval jurisprudence, but the debates engendered by the Templar prosecutions contributed to a slow evolution of more codified legal safeguards. These developments would play a role in the longer march toward formalized legal standards in Europe, though they were not immediate nor universally applied. In the modern era, the discovery and publication of archival materials have continued to reshape our understanding. Documents once thought lost re-emerged, new readings of confessions have been proposed, and the financial traces of Templar operations have been mapped with more precision. Each new document acts like a lens that refocuses the image of the order's collapse, sometimes blurring popular myths and sometimes confirming skeptical reconstructions. Historical truth, in this sense, is iterative, assembled over time by patient archival work rather than sudden revelation. The global imagination keeps returning to the Templars because their story contains archetypal elements, a religious mission that becomes worldly, an institution that accrues power and then confronts the state, a dramatic fall from grace, and a subsequent rebirth in myth. These elements make the order eternally compelling for authors and audiences seeking narratives about the interplay of faith, power, and fate. Yet the temptation to simplify must be resisted in order to honor the messy, human reality of the trials and the men who stood at their center. Even as scholarship matured, pop culture continued to feed simpler narratives. The idea of surviving Templars guarding secret knowledge or treasure offers a comforting plotline in which innocence or righteousness endures against the radiance of power. These stories often ignore the complex institutional failures and the societal transformations that produced the conditions for the order's suppression. They prefer a hero or a victim, while real history offers a chorus of actors each shaped by circumstance. The trials and suppressions had legal anniversaries and commemorations in small communities across Europe, where local memory kept the story alive in parish chronicles and folklore. These small acts of remembrance preserved variants of the story that rarely made it into official histories, offering fresh insights about how communities processed the shock of a vanished neighbor. In villages and towns, the Templars remained part of a living memory, folded into legends that blended fact and fiction across generations. There is also an architectural afterlife to consider. Many Templar sites entered the patrimony of new orders or secular powers, and the architecture itself bears traces of continuity and change. Chapels were rededicated, halls refitted for new uses, and gates became thresholds for different masters. The physical traces of the order are therefore palimpsests, layers of use and reuse that testify to the continuity of human habitation across ruptures of political narrative. The Templars have been invoked by modern movements seeking legitimacy or mystique, an appropriation that says more about present needs than about the historical order. Secret societies, esoteric groups, and even political movements have borrowed the Templar image because it connotes austerity, secrecy, and martial sanctity. This appropriation is a reminder that the past is a resource for the present, and that symbols can be detached from their contexts and repurposed for entirely different ends. When we return to the central arc of the trials, we find a blend of ambition and vulnerability. Philip sought fiscal solvency and political dominance, the papacy sought institutional stability and doctrinal authority, and the Templars, caught in the middle, were vulnerable because they had amassed both wealth and autonomy at a moment when centralized states were consolidating. The collision was therefore almost inevitable, a powerful monarchy confronting a transnational order whose autonomy implied a challenge to emerging state structures. Looking closely at the trials also forces us to think about the medieval mind and the ways that people conceptualized sin, authority, and truth. Confession served as spiritual practice and judicial instrument. The line between probing for heresy and extorting a desired confession was thin. The result is a historical moment where spiritual concerns were weaponized by political actors, and the consequences demonstrate how fragile institutional trust can be when spiritual penalties are mixed with financial interests. Finally, the end of the Templars illustrates a broader truth about institutions, that great organizations can fail not only because of moral decay but because the political conditions that sustain them change. The order had been adaptive and resourceful, but the rise of national monarchies, shifts in crusading politics, and the temptations of wealth created vulnerabilities that were lethal when combined with a determined sovereign. The downfall was not a single cause but an accumulation of structural pressures, opportunistic politics, and the human choices made under them. In the centuries since their suppression, the Templars have been both demonized and sanctified, a mirror for the anxieties and aspirations of successive generations. Their trials provide a rich case study in power, law, faith, and the social dynamics of accusation. To listen to their story attentively is to hear not a single moral, but an entire chorus of consequences, the seductive danger of wealth, the fragility of honor under pressure, the ways in which jurisprudence can be both instrument and casualty of political will, and the enduring human need to narrate trauma into myth. Long before the modern world named them legend, the Knights Templar walked a narrow line between chapel and battlefield, and their shadow has stretched across centuries. Their white mantles, marked by a simple red cross, became a sign that travelers, rulers, and chroniclers could not ignore. In this story we will follow their rise and fall, and then move beyond the archival dry facts to the myths and mysteries that have turned them into a permanent fixture of the human imagination. It begins in the spring of the 12th century, when a small band of knights made a vow not only to fight but to protect. Pilgrims who took the long road to Jerusalem were vulnerable from bandits and rough terrain, and the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem wanted more reliable protection on the routes that led to holy sites. In 1119, a man named Hugues de Payens gathered 9 companions and established a fraternity that mixed monastic rule with military purpose, trusting that God and tight discipline would make them something new. They were poor at first, almost invisible, lodged in a wing of the royal palace near the Temple Mount, which is why history later called them the Poor Fellows of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, and simply the Templars. Their early days were practical and quiet: prayer, training, guarding pilgrims, and begging for support in the courts of Christian Europe. The idea was simple and radical in equal measure: knights who vowed chastity, poverty, and obedience, and yet were allowed to bear arms and use violence on behalf of a spiritual cause. The order needed endorsement before it could grow, and the approval came with an unmatched advocate. Bernard of Clairvaux, a towering Cistercian abbot and theologian, wrote in praise of them, arguing that soldiers in God's service were not an ugly contradiction but an instrument of divine protection. That endorsement led to official recognition at the Council of Troyes in 1129, where a formal rule was established. With papal and monastic blessings, the Templars moved from a small venture into a European institution. Their rule combined liturgical routines with practical ordinances. Men rose for prayer in the thin hours before dawn, heard Mass, and then practiced with lance and sword. The organization established ranks and offices: a Grand Master at the head, marshals to command in battle, seneschals for administration, and commanders who supervised houses and priories across Christendom. The result was an order that functioned like a state within states, fiercely loyal to a central authority headquartered in Jerusalem and later in Europe. Power brought property. Noble patrons donated fields, castles, mills, and serfs, often in return for prayers, spiritual protection, or military aid. The Templars became large landowners in France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the Low Countries, as well as retainers in the Crusader states. With wealth came structure: estates produced food and income, sergeants and brothers administered resources, and a network of preceptories served as both warehouses and centers of recruitment. Perhaps the most consequential development was their role as financial intermediaries. Pilgrims and nobles alike entrusted valuables to the order for safekeeping. Over time, the Templars developed a system of letters of credit and depositories that allowed money and valuables to move across borders without the physical transport of coin. This proto-banking function was not a conscious invention of modern finance but a pragmatic adaptation, an institutional response to the order's geographic breadth and reputation for incorruptibility. Their reputation for discipline and zeal made the Templars a desirable military partner. On Levantine battlefields, they fought in tight formations, guarded strategic routes, and garrisoned key fortresses. They were sometimes at the center of triumphs, as at the Battle of Montgessard in 1177 when Frankish forces defeated a larger Muslim army. They were never invincible, however, and their fortunes rose and fell with the fortunes of the Latin kingdom. Templar architecture reflected both their sanctity and their pragmatism. In the east, they built citadels, stone fortresses on rocky outcrops, that could command valleys and roads. In Europe, preceptories had chapels, dining halls, and agricultural buildings, designed for both piety and production. Their buildings communicated authority and offered sanctuary, and many survive today as ruins that hint at a disciplined, austere lifestyle. The order's insignia was strikingly simple, a knight in white with a red cross. The color white suggested purity and monastic vocation, while the red cross spoke of martyrdom and the readiness to shed blood for Christendom. Such symbolism became a visual shorthand that people recognized across languages and lands. In time, the image would be exhumed and repurposed by storytellers, artists, and later political movements eager to borrow a mantle of holy legitimacy. Within their ranks were different social textures. Noble-born knights carried horses and armor and expected to lead, while sergeants and those without noble lineage performed essential labor, guarded lesser posts, and tended the logistics that made military campaigns possible. Brothers who served as chaplains, secretaries, and treasurers kept spiritual and administrative life in order. This mosaic of roles created a surprisingly modern division of labor within a medieval religious military institution. Daily life alternated between ritual and readiness. Meals were simple, prayers were frequent, and silence was valued as part of spiritual discipline. Yet the order drilled constantly in warfare, riding, swordplay, formation tactics, and the management of sieges. Discipline could be harsh, transgressions of the rule were judged severely, because cohesion and reliability were essential when men guarded sacred roads or defended a precarious fortress. As the Crusader states endured, the Templars found themselves increasingly enmeshed in politics and diplomacy. They negotiated truces, mediated disputes among barons, and sometimes acted as a counterweight to the ambitions of secular lords. Their transnational reach made them valuable as intermediaries in a fractured world. With time, however, their independence also invited suspicion, for a wealthy institution that answered primarily to Rome and its own hierarchy could feel like a sovereign that stood apart from kings. Military setbacks in the Holy Land tested the Templars' resources and morale. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 to Salah ad-Din and the subsequent battles forced the order to adjust its role. They fought at Hattin and later at the disastrous sieges that stripped the Crusader states of their principal holdings. Yet even in retreat they demonstrated persistence, fighting to hold Cyprus, Rhodes, and later, outposts on the European periphery. The loss of the Holy Land altered the order's identity. With Jerusalem gone, the temple as a physical home dissolved and the order relocated its headquarters to Acre and, after the city's fall, to European strongholds. This transition forced a reorientation. No longer centered on a single sacred city, the Templars had to consolidate resources in the West and define new missions. Their role in finance, estate management, and politics grew even more central as martial theater diminished. One paradox of the Templars was that their vow of poverty sat uncomfortably with their accumulation of riches. The order insisted its members could own nothing in personal capacity, but as an institution it amassed treasures and revenues. That distinction made them vulnerable to jealousies and accusations. Some contemporaries admired them for efficiency and piety, others envied the scale of their wealth and influence. The late 13th and early 14th centuries brought new pressures. European kings faced mounting fiscal needs, and monarchs who had once welcomed Templar assistance began to view them as an extractable resource. Territorial conflicts, the costs of maintaining armies, and the burden of sovereign debt created incentives to seek other sources of revenue. A powerful monarch, steeped in intrigue and hungry for treasure, could view a wealthy transnational order as both a bank and an obstacle. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, reigned with ambition and impatience. He had financial grievances against the order and considerable debts, including to the Templars themselves. His government also needed to consolidate royal power against feudal rivals and the Church, and he recognized that the Templars' autonomy and riches offered a solution. Behind the scenes, this calculus would harden into a plan that mixed legal pressure, propaganda, and, eventually, mass arrests. On a still morning in October 1307, the machinery of accusation spun into motion. Philip ordered the arrest of Templars across France, and his agents flooded the order's houses with soldiers. Many Templars were seized, including high-ranking leaders and humble members alike. The charges were dramatic: heresy, obscene rituals, secret denial of Christ, sodomy, and idolatry, accusations that in medieval Europe could justify capital punishment and confiscation of property. The use of torture shaped the confessions that followed. Under pain and fear, some knights confessed to the lurid charges, describing secret rituals, spitting on the cross, and worshipping a mysterious idol named Baphomet. Others retracted their confessions once pain subsided or when they appeared before papal judges, insisting their admissions were made under duress. These conflicting testimonies became a battleground of truth, law, and power that historians still unravel today. Philip used the confessions to justify a wider attack on the Templars' property and to secure papal cooperation. Pope Clement V, though skeptical about some accusations, issued bulls that placed the order under investigation and papal control. The pragmatic pope faced hard choices: resist a powerful king and risk conflict, or cooperate and risk the Church's moral authority. The tension between ecclesiastical principle and political reality shaped the outcome. Trials sprawled across Europe, but France was the epicenter. The legal theater there culminated with the sentencing of many members and the execution by burning of several high-ranking brothers. Yet the order's end was not uniform across Christendom. In England, Portugal, and parts of Italy, Templars were treated differently. Some were pardoned, others imprisoned, and many were absorbed into different military orders. The suppression, therefore, was a patchwork rather than a clean, universal dissolution. In 1312, under immense pressure, the Pope issued a bull that formally dissolved the order. The decision transferred many assets to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order, while leaving large questions about the Templars' fate. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314 after allegedly retracting his forced confessions and accusing the Pope and the King of injustice. His execution dramatized an end that would echo in rumor and legend for centuries. With the official suppression, new narratives began to germinate like seeds in fertile soil. Some were grounded in fact: secrets of wealth hidden before the arrests, the relocation of funds to safe houses, and legal maneuvers to protect property. Others sprouted from rumor: allegations of lost treasure, a secret initiation, and subterranean archives that contained dangerous knowledge. The gap between public record and private rumor became an invitation for storytellers and later investigators. The fantasy of hidden treasure is one of the most alluring Templar myths. People imagine chests of holy relics, gold, and sacred objects spirited away before Philip's men arrived. Some supposed the Templars had stashed items in underground vaults under preceptories or in the ruins of what had been Jerusalem. Archaeology has occasionally turned up Templar silver in coins, but the sweeping wagers about a single unified treasure remain speculative, fueled by narrative need more than archaeological proof. Another enduring thread is the Baphomet legend, whose origins are murky and contested. Medieval prosecutors used the term to describe the alleged idol the Templars worshipped, but whether it was a misheard corruption of Muhammad used by ill-informed accusers, an invented misdirection, or some distorted memory of a ritual word is uncertain. What the term accomplished in the trial was to make the Templars appear foreign and heretical, an accusation unmistakably dangerous in a Europe that equated orthodoxy with communal trust. Historians have peeled back layers of the trials and found much less coherent evidence of organized heresy than the medieval accusations suggested. Many confessions were extracted under torture, local politics motivated denunciations, and some of the charges reflected popular fears about secret societies and iconoclastic rites. Modern scholarship tends to view the suppression as the product of political calculation, fiscal pressure, and opportunistic crime rather than the discovery of an occult conspiracy. The Templars' role in the history of banking is often overstated but nevertheless important. Their network and reputation permitted early forms of international credit and secure transfer of value. Rich nobles and pilgrims entrusted them with assets, and the order issued letters of safe-conduct that allowed money and valuables to be redeemed elsewhere. This practice was a pragmatic arrangement that anticipated later developments in commercial banking, but it did not mean the Templars invented modern finance. Even as historians strip away some myths, the Templars remain an irresistible symbol for popular culture. In the 19th century, Romantics reimagined them as tragic guardians of lost wisdom, and writers embroidered their stories with Gothic drama. The 19th and 20th centuries saw an exuberant resurrection of Templar imagery in architecture, literature, and nation-making, often divorced from the messy medieval truths but powerful in forging collective identities. Freemasonry and the Templar connection illustrate how historical fragments can be transformed into symbolic lineages. Freemasons appropriated Templar motifs and created Templar degrees that recast the medieval order in Enlightenment-era moral language. For many Masons, invoking the Templars served as a way to claim continuity with chivalric values and a noble past, even when there was little direct historical link between medieval knights and modern fraternal ritual. The Holy Grail myths fused with Templar lore in a way that fed both. The idea that the Templars guarded a sacred chalice or secret knowledge that could confer spiritual or worldly power is a narrative that blends the Romance tradition with medieval suspicion of heresy. Stories of Rosslyn Chapel and tantalizing claims about hidden relics drew on this logic, creating a mythic chain that stretched from the 12th century to contemporary thrillers, films, and novels. One striking feature of the Templar legacy is how the order becomes a mirror for the anxieties and aspirations of different centuries. In times of secular authority's decline, people have rediscovered the Templars as symbols of transcendent order. In times of institutional distrust, they become figures representing secret knowledge or hidden elites. The malleability of their image helps to explain why every era reinvents the Templars to suit its narratives. Beyond myth and symbol, physical traces of the order remain in place names, ruins, and legal charters. Preceptories dot the English and French countryside, and fortifications in the Levant still bear architectural fingerprints. Charters record land transfers, papal bulls outline legal steps, and occasional inventories list silverware and vestments. Together, these fragments allow a careful reconstruction of real Templar life, even as they leave room for speculation about what could not be easily recorded. The Chinon parchment, a late and essential document discovered in the Vatican archives in the early 21st century, altered some conversations about culpability. It records a papal investigation that acknowledges the forced confessions and absolves certain leaders who had recanted. While it does not exonerate the entirety of the order in every place, it complicates the simple tale of guilt that earlier historians accepted for convenience or due to limited evidence. The parchment serves as a reminder that archival finds can reconfigure reputations even after centuries. Templar architecture in the East displays features designed for siege and sustainability: thick walls, towers for archers and crossbowmen, cisterns for water, and concentric defenses that forced attackers to fight one problem at a time. Their citadels were both military instruments and statements of permanence on contested soil. In Europe, preceptories served not only as local spiritual hubs but also as logistical nodes where food, weapons, and recruits were organized for dispatch to the Mediterranean theater. The order's relationship with secular rulers was never straightforward. Kings relied on them for military matters and credit, but they also resented the order's autonomy. Local lords sometimes envied Templar wealth or disputed boundaries and rights. Over time, these tensions accumulated into a tapestry of conflict, diplomacy, and negotiated settlement that varied by region and era. The Templars' military tactics emphasized discipline and heavy cavalry, but they also adapted to local conditions by using light infantry and local allies. They sometimes fought as shock troops to break enemy lines and sometimes held positions for months, resisting siege engines and starvation. Their adaptability made them valuable in the shifting military environment of the 12th and 13th centuries. Personal piety was central to official Templar identity. Daily offices, confession, and contemplative prayer sustained many members' spiritual lives. Yet the order also wrestled with worldly seduction. Wealth and prestige could corrupt, and the rule contained strictures intended to prevent excess. The tension between contemplative life and martial duty is one of the order's defining and most human features. The recruitment and composition of the Templars show a social cross-section of medieval Europe. Nobles supplied the mounted knights and much of the leadership, while younger sons without inheritance could join for spiritual and social reasons. Townspeople and lesser gentry filled other roles, and clerics provided sacramental services. This diversity gave the order a social depth that allowed it to flourish in complex political landscapes. Language and literacy were surprisingly prominent in the order. Secretaries and scribes recorded inventories, managed correspondence, and maintained the legal documents that kept the Templars solvent. Latin was the administrative tongue, but vernacular languages circulated within regions. The order's archive, shards of which remain today, was crucial for defending property claims and managing a pan-European institution. The suppression fractured lives and communities. Families lost patrons and tenants lost landlords, while local economies experienced disruptions when Templar farms and mills were seized or reassigned. Some houses became hospitaller preceptories, others fell into ruin, and in a few places former Templars quietly integrated into new orders or secular life. The human consequences of the suppression were immediate and long-lasting for countless ordinary people. Legal maneuvers after the fall were complex and often contradictory. Papal bulls tried to regularize the transfer of assets, but local jurisdictions, royal appetites, and the ambiguous status of some Templars created confusion. In many cases, royal officials seized Templar property before papal orders could be implemented. This legal chaos fueled rumors of wrongdoing and claims of injustice that resonated in narratives of martyrdom and conspiracy. The iconography and emblems associated with the Templars were later fished out of medieval insignia and given new meanings. Artistic depictions in later centuries often ignored historical nuance and turned the Red Cross into a badge of universal heroism or, conversely, of secret danger. Visual language is powerful because it communicates at a glance, and the Templar cross became a motif that could be reinvented across centuries. What role did the Templars play in the larger narrative of the Crusades? They were both cause and consequence. They emerged because of the logistical needs of crusading and in turn enabled campaigns by providing manpower, funds, and fortified bases. Their trajectory, from hopeful protectors of pilgrims to wealthy, politically entangled institution, mirrors the arc of the crusading movement itself, idealistic, resource-intensive, and ultimately challenged by shifting priorities and geopolitics. The psychological appeal of the Templars has to do with boundaries between sacred and profane, visible and hidden, loyalty to God and service to King. People have long been fascinated by organizations that cross these boundaries because they represent a blending of spheres that most institutions keep discreet. The Templars, who were simultaneously monks and warriors, offered a medieval answer to questions about how faith and force might be combined under an austere discipline. Scholars who study the Templars bring varied methods to the archives: diplomatic criticism to verify documents, archaeology to test sites, economic history to trace assets and accounts, and literary analysis to understand how myths formed. Interdisciplinary work has enriched the picture, showing how rumor and record interact. Fresh finds in monastic and royal archives continue to tweak our understanding, proving that history is an ongoing conversation rather than a closed book. The Templar legacy also contributed to legal innovations. Their international presence forced courts and lawyers to grapple with questions of property rights across borders, the legal personality of corporate bodies, and the interaction between ecclesiastical and secular jurisprudence. Some of these issues anticipated later developments in corporate law, even if the Templars themselves did not foresee modern legal categories. In the modern era, the Templars have been enlisted by ideologues across the political spectrum. Romantic nationalists in the 19th century sometimes invoked them as precursors of national militias or as exemplars of a lost chivalry. At other times, conspiracy theorists have used Templar motifs to suggest hidden continuity between medieval secrecy and modern shadow powers. This flexibility explains how a medieval monastic military order became a portable symbol in modern political rhetoric. In literature and film, the Templars have become fertile ground for creative license. From romanticized historical novels to action-packed thrillers, they provide instant stakes. Relics, secret rites, and ancient maps are convenient plot devices. Popular works often conflate different orders or invent rituals for dramatic effect, but they also keep the Templars alive in the public mind, ensuring that each generation discovers them anew in different guises. One curious offshoot of the Templar myth is the persistent association with Freemasonry and esoteric orders. This association often rests on thin historical evidence but gains substance from ritualistic borrowings and the desire among certain groups to claim descent from noble predecessors. Ritual, symbolism, and a taste for secrecy make for powerful cultural glue, and the Templar name provides an aura that rituals without deep historical roots sometimes need. The Templars' trials produced an outpouring of contemporary commentary that helps historians reconstruct motivations and methods. Chronicles, papal correspondence, royal registers, and private letters reflect a world in which propaganda and legal maneuver coexisted. A careful reading of these documents shows how narratives were formed, contested, and repurposed to justify decisions that were at once spiritual, financial, and political. Archaeology has offered corrective surprises. Excavations at Templar sites have revealed everyday details: a kitchen here, a smithy there, a repaired wall, human traces that balance the high drama of trials and martyrdom. Objects like pottery shards, coins, and simple devotional items speak to the ordinariness of life behind the austere image, reminding us that history is made up of quotidian details as much as spectacular events. Regional variations in the Templars' fate after 1312 testify to the unevenness of medieval rule. In Portugal, the order was effectively absorbed and continued to exist under the name of a reinvigorated military order with royal patronage. In England, political calculations delayed and complicated suppression. These regional divergences demonstrate that local contexts mattered profoundly, even when a papal bull claimed universal jurisdiction. The Templar motto and language of piety seem to have survived in surprising ways. Local legends in rural France persisted about strange knights and ghostly processions, while in certain towns Templar symbols decorated churches long after the order's formal demise. Oral memory tended to blur distinctions between fact and story, and centuries later those blurred memories became raw material for authors and antiquarians interested in medieval romance. The symbolic afterlife of the Knights Templar extends to architecture admired for its sublimity. Victorian and later architects borrowed elements of medieval design, sometimes explicitly invoking Templar models for chapels and lodges. While such architectural appropriations rarely reflect historical accuracy, they reveal a continued cultural desire to anchor modern sensibilities in imagined medieval exemplars. The story of Jacques de Molay retains a dramatic power that artists and writers have repeatedly returned to. Whether as a tragic victim of royal ambition or a figure of stubborn defiance, his final words and the image of a leader executed for the order's suppression resonate with archetypal themes: betrayal, martyrdom, and the end of an era. These themes have a universal allure, allowing de Molay's fate to become a pivot point in the Templars' mythic narrative. Popular conspiracy theories love to stitch improbable continuities from the medieval past to the present. Speculative claims of surviving Templar treasure, secret archives, or a hidden organizational lineage that bends toward modern power structures are usually unsupported by archival evidence. Yet the human appetite for secrets and the dramatic logic of if-only stories ensures that such narratives recur with persistence. In the world of video games, board games, and immersive entertainment, the Templars provide instantly recognizable iconography and storyline hooks. Designers borrow the Order's symbols, rank structures, and supposed secret rituals for the sake of gameplay and narrative tension. This modern repurposing is less about accuracy and more about resonance. The Templar brand carries a cachet that guarantees instant recognition and stakes. Museums have wrestled with how to present Templar artifacts responsibly. Exhibitions must balance the dramatic allure of relics against the need to contextualize them historically. Curators often use objects to tell a layered story: the ordinariness of daily life, the grandeur of Crusader ideals, the tragedy of suppression, and the long afterlife of myth. In doing so, they invite visitors to move between fact and legend and to reflect on why some stories endure. The language of martyrdom and sanctity surrounds the Templars' later narratives. Some circles have treated them as proto-protesters against king's overreach, while others argue they are emblematic of institutional corruption. These polar readings show how the same set of facts can be harnessed to support very different moral judgments about power, faith, and accountability. Revisionist histories have sought to remove the sensationalist tinge from Templar studies, replacing lurid portraiture with sober analysis. Scholars point to the complexity of medieval institutions, the contingency of political power, and the social networks that enabled the order's rise and fall. This corrective is not a denial of drama, but a rebalancing that values evidence and nuance over narrative closure. The Templars also left an imprint in legal and property records that scholars still mine for information. Feudal obligations, land grants, and disputes over boundaries are recorded in charters that, when carefully pieced together, show how the order functioned as an economic unit as much as a spiritual one. This documentary trail helps debunk exaggerations while illuminating the practical mechanics of medieval institutional life. The myth of the Templars as keepers of secret wisdom taps into a perennial human fascination with hidden knowledge. Legends of lost manuscripts, encoded symbols, and occult rites feed a fantasy in which meaning is stored like treasure awaiting rediscovery. While these are powerful stories, historians caution that tangible evidence for systematic esoteric knowledge guarded by the order is weak and largely conjectural. Over time, the Templars' reputation has been reshaped by national histories and the needs of identity-making. In some countries, they became part of a patriotic past, while in others they were framed as ominous reminders of elite privilege. How each society remembers them tells us as much about the remembering community as it does about the medieval order itself. Modern Neo-Templar groups, fraternal, charitable, or ceremonial, often disclaim historical continuity while consciously borrowing imagery and ritual. They are expressions of a desire for ritualized meaning and noble purpose in a secular age. Whether they champion charity, craft, or esoteric study, these groups show the ongoing cultural appeal of a medieval symbol recast for contemporary values. The question of whether any Templars survived the suppression as a coherent underground movement is tantalizing but unproven. Records do show that a number of knights resettled or entered other orders, and rumors persisted of clandestine gatherings. Yet the kind of centralized secret society imagined in popular fiction lacks credible archival support. What did survive was more diffuse, a scattering of traditions, symbols, and stories that nourished later imaginings. Historians emphasize context when analyzing accusations against the order. The medieval imagination operated differently from ours. Heresy was not merely doctrinal dissent but a social threat that could undermine community trust. That categories of belief were used as political weapons is not surprising. In the Templars' case, allegations of spiritual deviation merged with fiscal and territorial ambitions to create a charged and lethal mix. Despite centuries of scrutiny, some things about the Templars remain obdurately resistant to conclusive answers. The precise content of certain rituals, the real extent of any centrally managed treasure, and the innermost motivations of individual members are details often lost to time. The gaps invite both scholarly inquiry and imaginative reconstruction, creating an ongoing dialogue between researchers and storytellers. The story of the Templars invites reflection on power's double edge, the capacity to protect and the capacity to attract destructive envy. Power granted the order the means to do good, whether through defending travelers or administering estates, but the same power made it a target for ambitious rulers. This ambivalence captures a larger human tension about institutions of concentrated authority. The Templars also intersect with the history of ritual secrecy because their new form, a monastic brotherhood that fought, was itself an innovative blending of spiritual and military life. Rituals that reinforced identity and loyalty were practical tools in an institution whose efficacy depended on cohesion and obedience. That those rituals later became fodder for suspicion is predictable. Closed systems breed speculation when they collapse. Technology and digital archives have changed the way scholars investigate Templar history. Where once researchers depended on physically traveling to scattered archives and poring over fragile manuscripts, digitization allows wider access and cross-comparison. This has accelerated scholarship and allowed for collaborative projects that would have been difficult in earlier eras, enriching the historical conversation with broader evidence. The Templars' story has been told and retold by those who wanted to find moral exemplars, scandalous villains, or secret keepers of ancient truths. Each retelling reflects the storyteller's moment and interests. Understanding this layering of narratives helps us see how history moves from event to memory to symbol, and how cultural needs shape the past into forms that resonate with the present. Artistic representations of the Templars vary wildly, from idealized knights on horseback to shadowy conspirators in candlelit cellars. Artists choose which aspects to emphasize: valor, piety, secrecy, or treachery, and those choices reveal as much about contemporary values as about medieval realities. Art thus becomes an interpretive medium that translates archival ambiguity into decisive images. If one thing is certain, it is that the Templars' endurance lies in their flexibility as a cultural symbol. They can be made to represent purity or corruption, guardianship or danger, spiritual discipline or secret knowledge. That malleability has ensured their survival in the cultural imagination far beyond the lifespan of their actual institution. Religious historians often explore the spiritual dimensions of Templar identity, asking how a militant order maintained devotional life under the constant stress of war and administration. The order's texts, prayers, and liturgical practices reveal attempts to sacralize violence in a manner consistent with contemporary theology. Understanding these spiritual dimensions helps explain the order's internal cohesion and public appeal during its heyday. Economists and social historians examine the order as an economic actor, mapping its estates, income streams, and labor relations. These scholars remind us that religious fervor alone cannot account for the order's presence. Practical economic management underpins sustainability. Farms, mills, textile workshops, and taxable incomes were the backbone of the Templars' capacity to project power across borders. As museums and scholars curate exhibitions about the Templars, they also wrestle with ethical questions about heritage. Whose story is being told, and who benefits from the commercialization of a religious military past? These questions matter because how artifacts are displayed shapes public understanding and can either perpetuate myth or promote informed scrutiny. The Templars' cultural afterlife has an instructive edge. It shows how institutions can be mythologized into symbols that outlive their original purposes. In an age hungry for narratives of hidden meaning and moral clarity, the Templar story feeds multiple desires: for heroism, for scandal, and for the secret that explains history's messy turns. Recognizing this helps us approach their past with both fascination and caution. Ultimately, the Knights Templar occupy a liminal space between medieval reality and modern imagination, a position that guarantees their continued relevance. They are historically essential for understanding the Crusades, medieval monastic military life, and early financial mechanisms. At the same time, they are simultaneously more than their history. Their symbolic afterlife continues to evolve as every generation projects its fears and hopes onto the white mantle with the Red Cross. As you drive or go about your work later, you may pass a ruined wall or a chapel and find yourself wondering what whispers survived from orders like the Templars. The past does not arrive into the present fully intact. It comes through fragments and stories that require scrutiny and imagination in equal measure. The Knights Templar are a vivid testament to how institutions can shape history and how history, in turn, becomes myth. The narrative of the Templars offers a final lesson about the uses and dangers of secrecy. Closed disciplines can create strong cohesion and purpose, but secrecy also invites suspicion and, when power shifts, catastrophic exploitation. Their suppression exemplifies how vulnerable even devout institutions can be when political interests align against them. Even after we strip away the legends of hidden grails and subterranean vaults, the fascination endures because humans are drawn to stories that test the limits of power, faith, and loyalty. The Templars' combination of sacred vow and martial force produces archetypal drama, a group consecrated to God whose very strength becomes the cause of its undoing. That drama, in its many retellings, keeps the Templars alive in memory and imagination. When scholars debate the Order's legacy today, they do more than parse medieval facts. They ask what contemporary institutions might learn from the Templars' strengths and vulnerabilities. Lessons about accountability, transparency, and the management of accumulated power are surprisingly relevant. The past, then, becomes a lens through which modern societies can reflect on how to balance mission, wealth, and authority. In the end, the enduring legacy of the Knights Templar is a tapestry woven from fact and fiction, devotion and ambition, service and scandal. Their stones and charters remain for those who would study them, while their myths continue to provide fertile ground for storytellers. This dual legacy, historical and symbolic, ensures that the Templars will continue to occupy the borderlands between recorded history and the imaginative stories we tell ourselves to explain it. Subscribe if you feel drawn to the brotherhood of the Templars that lives between history and legend. Then comment below, are you a defender of their devotion or an exposer of their scandals?